Chapter 4:26 Burning Meal. Once the door closed and locked, the racket outside disappeared. Gone were the cooing of birds, or the chirping of cicadas, or even the rustling of the wind. Even if a nuke were to hit the house next to them, they probably wouldn't hear anything. Instead, a different kind of ruckus ensued. Jake had excellent perception, so her heartbeat and quiet breathing compounded his own, pounding in his ears like a relentless drum. It was all the more distressing because, unlike normal humans, both of them had an unusual metabolism. Instead of the usual 60 heartbeats per minute at rest in a normal human, which could drop below 30 in highly trained endurance athletes, Jake's heart was only beating once or twice a minute. As for the young woman, it didn't go beyond 5. When it came to breathing, the difference was even more extreme. Jake only took a shallow breath once every 2 or 3 minutes. Carmen breathed only slightly more often, her CHESD rising imperceptibly from time to time. So why was Jake going on about a ruckus? Simply because every time he started to relax, a heartbeat, an inhale, or simply a shift in the young woman's position was enough to break his concentration. Of course, he was not so easy to distract, but it happened that the woman under his protection was gorgeous, probably the hottest he had ever met, and he was just a little too aware of her presence. Add to that, the intoxicating fragrance accompanying her wherever she went, and it didn't take much to throw off a hardened bachelor like Jake. The fact that neither of them took the slightest initiative to break this silence made their cohabitation even more awkward. Jake's house had only one room with a tiny bathroom. The bed, kitchen, and dining table were all in the same room, which inevitably forced them to rub shoulders. There was no privacy. Even the bed was only big enough for one person. So they kept staring into each other's eyes for a long half-hour, each sitting on one of the few pine stools that furnished his house. Neither of them admitted defeat. While Jake was clearly too bulky for the tiny stools and extremely uncomfortable, Carmen stood on hers in an extremely prim manner, one leg resting on the other like a refined lady applying her etiquette lessons to the letter. Jake had all the time to lose himself in her spellbinding ruby irises and her blood-red lips. From time to time, the young woman would nibble on her lip or run her hand through her hair while slightly flexing her CHESD. He then had a first-class view on her vertiginous cleavage. At these moments, Jake was glad that his first coaching mission had been to overcome his fear of eye contact. Come to think of it, it had been a long time since the coaching feature had sent him a training program or even a personal development mission. To be honest, he had almost forgotten that this feature existed. Between the ordeals and the Oracle's unpredictability, Jake had finally grown out of it. In addition to her exceptional beauty, Jake also became acutely aware once again of her extreme pallor, abnormally low body temperature, dark circles, and subtly parched skin to the trained eye. "Do you want something to eat or drink?" Jake blurted out when the young woman smiled politely at him after catching him red-handed leering at her cleavage. After hearing his question, Carmen regained some steam and reflexively licked her cracked lips before answering against all odds. "I'll be fine. I have a delicate digestive system, and I'm afraid the food served here will be lethal to me." Jake followed her envious glance toward the fruit-filled bowl before seeing her shake her head ruefully. What's the matter with this chick? If she's hungry, can't she eat like everyone else? Unable to bear the suffocating tension, Jake suddenly stood up, pretended to stretch, and decided to pretend she wasn't there. As usual, he snapped his fingers to light a blaze in the fireplace and threw in a few logs to fuel it. Without bothering Carmen, he entered the fireplace as if it were nothing and sat down cross-legged in the middle of the flames. Soon he heard only the crackling of the flames lickng his face, and he managed to enter into meditation, effectively cutting himself off from the rest of the world. Carmen's dull eyes flashed into focus as he lit the fire, and they widened fully as he stepped into the flames. Unnoticed by Jake, her face showed signs of wavering. In his bubble, Jake continued to think about how to fight the corruption. She had been very clear. It was unstoppable and undefendable. The closest analogy was that of an ink stain falling into water. Once the ink mixed with the rest of the liquid, it was impossible to get rid of it by conventional means. The same was true for sugar water or any other homogeneous mixture. Of course, science had found more or less complex methods of reversing some of these reactions, but there were also irreversible reactions. Despite Xi's persuasion, Jake was still a logician. The word impossible was not in his vocabulary. There were just things that were not yet understood. It was by striving to answer these unanswerable questions that science and knowledge progressed step by step. Using the analogy of the ink stain in the glass of water, his master plan could be summarized in 2 words: more water. It was, unglamorously, the most popular method used by unscrupulous companies to get rid of their waste. The oceans being so vast, wastewater and toxic products had been dumped into them for decades before any visible impact was seen. Jake was aware that this method was far from perfect, but it was a viable way to save time. The water in his case was his spirit, body, and soul. Even after all this time practicing, it was still unclear to him what the difference was between the two. What he did know was that where his conscience was, his soul was certainly there. That was why he had been injured and suffered temporary headaches and amnesia after clashing with his spirit body against mental attacks at the end of his second ordeal. Conversely, it was also why he had not suffered at all when he had cut off a piece of his spirit body to create the permanent ether spells that made up the sun of his floating island. Now he had to figure out how to grow his spirit body as fast as possible at a speed that rivaled the corruption's expansion. Jake rarely checked his skill status, but this time he took a moment to do so. Meditation, 97 points. Novice, you have received no systemic training in this area, but by combining your knowledge with the guidelines of the coaching feature, you have achieved a decent level of expertise. You can calm down, exercise, and slightly increase some of your cognitive faculties through regular practice. Considering that his cyber engineering degree only peaked at 51 points when he acquired the bracelet, his 97 points in meditation practically put him on the level of a Tibetan monk in seclusion since childhood. The reason why such a staggering progression was possible was his inconceivable cognitive stats. To be exact, all of his skills without exception had a similar progression pattern. Whether it was his swordsmanship, close combat, and even cyber engineering, all of these skills exceeded 75 points even when he hadn't practiced them for a long time. But now, he was forced to abandon his original plan. I need to grow this meditation skill, Jake concluded dispassionately. Since the novice mark was clearly readable, there was no doubt that this one had a huge amount of room for improvement. Until now, he had practiced mediation like an earthling, without including any overly sophisticated ether spell or control. It was time to step up a gear. Just as Jake's mind was reaching enlightenment, his dreams of grandeur burst like a soap bubble over a candle flame. Abruptly snapping out of his trance, he suddenly felt immense danger. What's going on? Why can't I move? Jake tried to open his eyes, but could not. Reaching out, he realized what had alerted him. He could no longer hear the crackling of the flames. Did someone put out the fire? Carmen? Or a monster? You were poisoned, she informed him in exasperation. Thanks, I know. Jake grunted, feeling slightly guilty. Not a big deal. Stimulating his eye nerves with his strength, constitution, and intelligence ether, Jake forced his heavy eyelids open. Looking down, he locked onto a long, recognizable brown mane that could only belong to one person, Carmine. The fuck are you doing? Jake enunciated with difficulty in an icy tone. Carmen shivered at the sound of his voice, not expecting him to wake up so soon. Feeling her meal slipping away, she stopped playing with her prey and immediately sank her fangs in, clenching her jaw with all her might. Hungry for several days, she felt a small climax of anticipation at the prospect of fresh blood flooding her mouth soon. Except that she waited patiently, but the so much awaited ecstasy never came. After about 10 seconds, she realized that her fangs had not managed to completely cross the barrier of his skin, and underneath, a layer of muscles as hard as titanium fibers still separated her from the precious carotid artery. Damn it, she gnashed her teeth. Mobilizing her ether, she finally managed to sink her fangs, and a tiny drop of blood grazed the tip of her tongue. Alas, her joy was short-lived. The next second, Jake's temperature soared, and the barely visible vein network formed a distinctive lava mesh. The second drop of blood Carmen ingested proved to be very different from the first. Her tongue instantly melted in her mouth, and a searing pain seared the roof of her mouth. Arg! The next thing she knew, she was rolling on the floor with her hands over her throat, spitting out cauterized blood. Chapter 4:27 The Pit. Watching listlessly as the young woman spasmed on the floor, snarling in agony, Jake continued to devote his attention to regaining full control of his body. About 30 seconds later, Carmen was able to contain the heat and pain overwhelming her, and she stopped flailing around, her dress soaked with cold sweat. But in that short moment, Jake had recovered all of his strength. He was about to retaliate, just to show her what he was made of, when an incongruous event interrupted him. Contestant Carmen Leash broke the rules by attacking contestant Jake Wilderth at 2:56 a.m. during the night-day phase. She will be punished by being sent to the pit. The sentence will be carried out immediately. If she survives her trial, she will reappear in the central square of the village in front of the fountain. As if it had just received a signal, the aging wooden floor suddenly split in two, opening a bottomless pit beneath the condemned vampire. Stronger than she looked, she did not immediately fall into the void, just as Jake did. Swinging wide, her feet stayed on either side of the floor, and she even managed to leap into the air to grab onto the chandelier hanging from the ceiling. "Aren't you one of the monsters?" Jake came to realize at last, though a tad doubtful. "Good grief, I'm not," she snapped when she felt an irresistible attractive force sucking her towards the abyss. The chandelier to which she was clinging threatened to come down any second. In fact, the roof, denser than lead, was already beginning to crack. "Don't forget our contract." Carmen lost it for good when she noticed Jake's stolid countenance, even finding the leisure to fill himself a glass of water. "Why should I?" Jake raised a sarcastic eyebrow. "You attacked me. The contract is void. You haven't forgotten all the clauses I added to it?" "It's not what you think. It wasn't supposed to be like this." She tried to defend herself as best she could, but from the snide look on his face, she might as well have been talking to a wall. "And what was supposed to happen?" Jake retorted. "I'm dying of anemia and general indifference, and you walk away leaving me 3 million? Carmen opened her mouth as if to retort something, but the chandelier broke at that very moment. Sucked in by the gravitational pull, she fell with no grip to hold on to, and Jake truly thought she had slipped into the pit. Yet, as she disappeared, Jake heard her roar madly from the bottom of the pit and saw a blood-red crystal scythe rise from the darkness. It then planted itself against a ledge of the chasm, like a pickaxe striking down a deposit to better mine it. Leaning over the hole, Jake saw a sickly Carmine clutching a long ruby chain with her left hand, while her right palm was bleeding profusely, the chain deeply embedded in the middle. Stroking the scythe's blade with his fingertips, he sensed a characteristic energy signature within the chain, and inferred that it was not a concrete object. The vampire had undoubtedly sacrificed a huge portion of her vitality to materialize this weapon. When the young woman met his gaze this time, her ruby eyes were filled with despair, and he also discerned a tinge of pleading. "Why are you so afraid of this pit? It's just another hardship." Jake looked at her in genuine curiosity. "It's the very reason we're in these ordeals. To be tested. I can't lose. Not yet." Carmen gritted her teeth, her grip beginning to loosen. "I just needed a little blood. If you hadn't woken up, you wouldn't have known the difference the next morning. 3 million for some blood was a fair price." "And why should I believe you?" Jake snickered. "The contract," she exclaimed exasperatedly. The floor in which her scythe was stuck was about to shatter too. "Do you really think I haven't memorized the clauses? I'm a vampire of the noble Leash clan, not one of those inferior bloodsuckers." Jake frowned. She wasn't lying. Given the urgency of her situation, reading those emotions was a breeze. "Very well. I'll honor my part of the contract. After all, I've already been paid." Jake changed his mind. He raised his arm over the abyss, palm down, and said just to show off, "Rise." The pull of the abyss was suddenly counterbalanced by an even more intense force, and Carmen felt her body become lighter than a feather. The next moment, she was rising to the surface, carried by the air currents like a helium balloon. The young woman finally breathed a sigh of relief as she recognized the pine furniture of Jake's home, but that was the moment the robotic voice chose to destroy her last hopes. Contestant Jake Wilderth broke the rules by helping Carmen Leash escape her punishment at 2:59 a.m. during the night-day phase. He will be punished along with Carmen by being sent to the pit. The sentence will be carried out immediately. If he survives his trial, he will reappear in the central square of the village in front of the fountain. Upon hearing the sentence, Jake's expression also changed for the first time. Seriously? In a hurry, Jake grabbed the crystallized blood chain with one hand and with a quick motion snatched Carmine from the chasm, sending her flopping behind him. He thought the young woman was out of the woods when he remembered the words of the robotic voice. Punished along with Carmen. Fuck. Jake cursed as he saw the floor disappear completely, an endless darkness engulfing the entire house. To escape, he would have to break through the ceiling or one of the walls, but this time the pit runes gave him no chance. An immeasurable gravitational force surged out of nowhere from the depths of the abyss, with such intensity that he felt his joints crack. His veins and arteries were so compressed that the flow of oxygen to his brain was also affected. His vision narrowed and his cognitive abilities weakened noticeably. Still holding the blood chain linking him to Carmen, Jake continued to float in the air for a few minutes, forming a status quo with the runes of the pit below him. He briefly hesitated to go all out, activating bloodline ignition and the silver ore in his cells, but eventually relented. From the moment he made his decision, he stopped resisting. Carmen, who was clinging to life, sensed his determination and accepted her fate as well. Still clutching her chain, she let Jake drag her down to the bottom of the abyss. Jake and the vampire fell for several long minutes, which felt like forever, the total darkness depriving them of any sense of direction. At the end of the long fall, the two criminals welcomed a change. An orangish spark appeared in their field of vision, and they knew that they had finally arrived at their destination. A few seconds later, they landed in a pool filled with an orange liquid reminiscent of pumpkin soup with a big splash. Air! Carmine's gut-wrenching scream nearly burst his eardrums as they crashed into the vile mixture. Jake grunted covered in blood, his skin itching like he'd just rubbed himself with a mutant itching powder 1,000,000,000 times more irritating than normal. He had to summon all his willpower to keep from peeling himself like a vegetable. It's truly a pit, Jake noted with an almost disappointed tone. The correct word would be that they were in a large, poorly lit cavern, since the chasm had closed over them. There were small holes in the walls, evenly spaced and reminiscent of the architecture of a termite mound. Aside from the pool they had landed in, Jake noticed that they were on a thin rocky platform surrounded by some sort of greenish lava. In any case, the heat was real. Even he wasn't confident he could get away unscathed from exposing his body to this substance. But they had a bigger problem. "We stink," Jake remarked as he sniffed his arms covered in abrasive pumpkin soup. Experimentally, he tasted the liquid with the tip of his tongue before spitting it out immediately. Bitter and hot, but edible, he concluded summarily. If this was the purgatory, it was nothing writing home about. Of course, that was impossible. Unlike Peter Brady, this pool was not a deadly poison, at least not for players like them. A non-fluid wielder native might have died, but not them. The execution of the sentence will begin in 3, 2, 1, 0. A countdown resounding in the cave spared him this headache. Simultaneously, a groan of pain beside him informed him that Carmen was awake. "Why does my head hurt like this?" she muttered as she rubbed the back of her head. "No idea." Jake turned to her before immediately looking away. Unlike her armor, her dress was plain satin. Harmful or not, the dress hadn't survived their plunge into the pumpkin basin. The woman was stark and naked. She did not, however, have time to be mortified with shame. From the darkness filling the galleries dotting the walls, an alien cackling sounded, raising the hairs on their spines. Soon, more inhuman cackles and growls answered it, and specks of silver light filled those holes like stars in the night sky. Jake, I can't fight right now. I've used up too much blood," Carmen explained anxiously, covering her breasts and genitals as best she could with her hands. Jake inspected her condition and had to admit that she was right. "Leave it to me." Within a breath, the obsidian floor was molded into various weapons and pieces of armor that could be worn by a woman with Carmen's proportions. "Help yourself," he ordered in a commanding tone. The vampire gawked at him like an idiot, as if meeting him for the first time. Without saying anything, she appraised the pieces of armor and put on the ones that best fit her. A minute later, with her helmet, chest protector, leggings, shoulder pads, armband, as well as a long sword and shield, she now looked like a gladiator. Chapter 4, 28 Team Fight. Hiss. A wrinkled, clawed paw poked out of one of the holes. The skin was a sickly gray with a network of dark veins, while the claws were ink black, long and curved enough to slit their throats effortlessly. The rest of the creature soon followed. The size of a calf, a simian morphology with thin tentacles and suckers instead of what should have been its hair. When the monster yawned, long thin teeth reminiscent of Venom's jaws in the Marvel Universe were humbly put on display. Although somewhat different in some aspects, it was indeed a hunter parasite like those of the horde that had chased them earlier. Still, it was enough to make Carmen despair. At their best, these monsters were small fry for the vampire aristocracy, but in her current state one of them was already overkill. And sadly, it was not alone. As soon as the first hunter, more daring than the others, began to cackle, dozens, hundreds of similar monsters poured out of the depths of the tunnels. They soon realized that the first creature had only its fearlessness to show for it after meeting its brethren. Those of calf-like proportions were in the minority by far. On average, these monsters were as big as adult gorillas, and the most massive ones stood on their broad hind legs, making them giants of over 4 meters in height. These particular giants were different from the others. Their chests, skulls, and other vulnerable body parts were clad in a kind of natural armor reminiscent of crustacean shells, and their long, agile tails ended with a natural club at the tip, itself fitted with a stinger. They were a perfect predator, and despite distinct differences, their resemblance to the digesters he knew was uncanny. Shriek! A long, shrill howl was suddenly released by one of these giants, but Jake noticed that its mouth remained closed. It was only when he activated his Murtharian sight that he spotted an ugly creature halfway between a dry baby and a spider clinging to the top of its head. Blending into the background like a chameleon, he had almost missed it. Its lone silver, bulging, watery eye was riveted on the duo, twinkling eerily with each of its heartbeats. As soon as the abomination let out its loud shriek, the hunters swooped down on them as one. Jake immediately recognized by elimination one of the controllers that the pirate captain had theorized about, but never met in person. As Carmen braced herself for impact, gripping the hilt of her weapon so tightly that her knuckles ached, Jake ignored the impending threat to focus on the controller. Activating bloodline ignition, he consciously pushed his cardiovascular system to its peak in a heartbeat, raising his blood pressure to a level that would have made a normal human heart explode. His body temperature rose in turn, and a torrent of red, yellow, and orange ether washed over his legs to increase his explosiveness tenfold. A wink later, a shockwave pierced the eardrums of all the monsters in his wake. As he reappeared at the other end of the cave, his machete buried up to its guard in the skull of the most gigantic hunter. Between the top of the bloody skull and the hilt of his machete, a deformed arachnoid creature was skewered, wailing in pain. Its untouched eye was sobbing profusely, filled with terror and utter incomprehension. Even as its light went out and its consciousness faded, the intelligent creature kept its traumatized expression. It was by far the most sophisticated emotion he had observed in these parasites since the beginning, and it set them apart from the digesters. The digesters had proven that they could be intelligent, but they had always behaved with utter selflessness, as if their existence were of no value. If such digesters also existed, then what made them so different from the other mirror universe aliens that getting along was no longer an option? In any case, as soon as the controller died, the other parasites lost their commander and returned to their chaotic behavior. The giant hunter he had just killed collapsed heavily, releasing long strands of dark energy that he was unfortunately forced to ignore. Jake had already tried to absorb this mixture of ether and fluid, but the yield was extremely poor. However, it was still meat, and he would never have overlooked it if that was the only reason. The actual reason was corruption. She wasn't sure if the resulting ether was safe. Smash! A long mane of brown hair shot past his eyes like a cannonball and slammed into the wall a few meters away. A fractured obsidian helmet rolled to the ground, revealing Carmen's once perfect face. Her small trumpet nose had been crushed, her sensuous lips were swollen and bloody, while one of her black eyes was completely closed. Because of Jake's blitzkrieg, the vampire had been left alone to take the full brunt of the enemy's charge. "For God's sake, help me!" Carmen's distressed cry brought him back to reality. The young woman had surpassed his expectations, for hunters lying dead and bloodless at her feet in mere seconds. But a giant hunter had managed to pin her down with all its weight. Dozens of lesser creatures were biting at her limbs like rabid dogs, and if it weren't for the pieces of armor Jake had made for her, she would have been torn to pieces by now. Jake bolted to her assistance, slicing everything in his path, but his superhuman movements drew the attention of the rest of the monsters, who gathered into a mountain of flesh to block his path. Sensing her demise, Carmen gave up the futile idea of conserving her energy. The giant hunter's huge clawed hand was crushing her ribcage, and the supporting armor was already beginning to break apart. Its destruction would spell her end. Resolute, she bit her tongue and blood spurted out, forming an ephemeral fountain that blinded the monster for a short time. Instead of falling back, the blood flared up, releasing an intense reddish light, and as she took a deep breath, it was sucked back into her mouth. After this ritual, her extinguished eyes regained an intense ruby glow, piercing the darkness of the cave like two car headlights at night on the highway. An aura of bloody red light burst forth from the depths of her being, and Carmine's drenched hair began to float in the air as if it were being battered by a powerful hurricane. Scram! With a violent twist of her torso, she sent the small hunters hanging on her flying and broke free of the giant hunter's grasp, knocking him off balance. The skull of the monster slumped over her, and she mercilessly seized the opportunity to retaliate with a powerful palm strike. The creature of more than 1 ton and 4 meters in height shot back up to more than 10 meters high, the back of its head in contact with her back after a 180 degrees tilt. After that, it was nothing but carnage and massacre. Jake had to admit that without bloodline ignition, as long as he carried his liquid alloy, she would be faster than he was. Her strength was also prodigious, barely below Kevin's werebear form. Not to be outdone, Jake also pulverized everything in his path, using the advantage of his weight and strength to dominate all the giant hunters in single combat. If Jake struck down from the sky, his weight alone was enough to crush any enemy. A few hours later, the monsters stopped spawning from the tunnels, and the cavern grew quiet again. The rocky floor was long gone, buried by a pile of monsters several meters high. At the end, a new parameter had come to complicate the fight. Jake and Carmen had thought these monsters were coming for them, but they soon realized that they were just appetizers for the hunters. What these creatures really craved was the itchy pumpkin soup and the emerald lava lining the cave. It wasn't until they got their first taste of it, and a hunter gorilla mutated right in front of them after landing in the lava, that they remembered that these aliens could literally absorb heat and energy. Fortunately, they had reacted in time, and Jake had chopped its head off before it could complete its evolution. The battle over, Carmen was about to finish off the last hunter when Jake stopped her. Wait, don't kill him just yet. Why? To buy time, Jake replied as if it was obvious. If his theory was correct, once this monster was killed, they would be sent back to the village square. The previous convicts who had survived had always returned after a few hours, which was their situation. It should be noted that none of the natives sentenced to the pit had returned. Peter Brady and the late Chinantacio were the only exceptions, and they were both players. Carmen put her weapon away and let him deal with the creature. With his earth control, neutralizing this wounded hunter was a breeze. A second later, it was completely encased in a rock tomb, with just enough ventilation to breathe. Chapter 4:29 Green Lava. And now, Carmen asked in a barely audible whisper. Her voice was so weak, one could have thought she was mute. She never heard his answer. As Jake opened his mouth to speak, her eyes rolled back and the bloody aura surrounding her faded along with her consciousness. Staggering dangerously, Jake steadied her, then laid her on the ground before she could collapse. As he carried her, he realized how light she was, the vampire weighing barely heavier than a feather between his arms. As he laid her down, he saw her skin wither and her muscles melt away, like a kite with only the frame left. She has overdrafted her body. But don't worry, vampires usually have few weaknesses compared to humans. They can't die as long as they have their heads on their shoulders. So I don't have to do anything? Jake quipped, pleasantly surprised. I didn't say that. So what now? We'll have to give her some blood. She let out a long, exasperated sigh. Otherwise, Her body will remain in hibernation for several centuries before withering away for good. It's a survival mechanism for when their bodies are starving. A vampire of this level can last about 500 years in this state, but she's far from being in top shape. If she lasts half a century, that'll be pretty good. I see. But in that case, why didn't she just drink the blood of the animals in the village, or even the monsters we just killed? Jake asked the question that was bothering him the most. She mulled over this riddle for a moment before answering. I don't know, but it's a good thing she didn't consume the blood of those parasites. Corruption? I'm afraid so. Jake wasn't against saving her, but he was reluctant to slit his wrists. He had given blood once on Earth, but not out of charity or altruism. The truth was that he didn't want to owe anyone anything. If he had an accident and needed a transfusion, he would have a clear conscience. It was selfish and childish, but it was the real him. He could have sacrificed a fraction of his bloodline ether to form some blood essence for his comrades, but he had refused to make that small donation so as not to compromise his own growth. Ultimately, he was far from an exception. In retrospect, none of his companions had sacrificed anything important for the rest of the team. If they had, Jake's pride would have prevented him from taking advantage without reciprocating. And now Jake was faced with the choice of abandoning Carmen to her fate or giving his precious blood to revive her. By the Oracle, stop waffling on for nothing. She rolled her eyes as she watched him sink into a stupid dilemma. It's just a little blood. You can regenerate several liters in a few minutes if you focus your vitality on your bone marrow. You can always make her pay for it later. She's unconscious anyway. You can even force her to sign another slave or pet contract if you want. Yeah, right. Jake scratched his head awkwardly. With She's admonition, Jake managed to convince himself to be generous and slashed his right wrist with one of his claws before bringing it to the sleeping young woman's bloodless lips. A drop of blood dripped with difficulty, then nothing more. Examining his wrist, Jake found out with a jaded face that the cut had already coagulated. Fuck. Of course. This had to be made even more unpleasant. He grimaced in a bad mood. In the end, slicing deeply into his wrist did the job, and he contracted his artery sphincters to increase the blood pressure. With his telekinesis, the ejected blood formed a scarlet river wafting through the air to Carmen's stomach. As soon as a drop of blood touched the vampire's lips, her face flushed with color. A heartbeat more deafening than a rocket at takeoff hailed her return to life, and in a few seconds her emaciated body returned to its original splendor, like a hastily inflated blow-up doll. Then, she opened her eyes. The pupils dilated. She licked her lips ecstatically and moaned. More. Carmen pounced on him, and he immediately cut the blood valve, instead grabbing her by the throat and slamming her down. She struggled, trying to bite his fingers, until he clamped down on her jaw. Enough. Incapacitated and with no blood to consume, the glare inhabiting the vampire's eyes subsided, and she regained some semblance of lucidity. You can let me go. I won't attack anymore, she declared icily a few moments later after the smell of blood had cleared up. I'm glad. Jake snorted as he flaunted his bruised wrist in front of her face. You're healthy now, so we don't owe each other anything. Surprisingly, Carmen blushed and looked away instead of getting angry. The fuck is wrong with you? Jake mumbled in annoyance. What little appreciation and good feeling she might have for him vanished immediately with those few words. Oomph, she harumphed before turning her back on him. Whatever. Jake had other fish to fry rather than endure the whims of a high-class vampire. If he'd spared the last monster, it wasn't out of compassion, but for a specific purpose, to explore. As soon as Jake saw the greenish lava, he knew his chance had come. Without a horde of parasites to bother him, he now had plenty of time to investigate the place. First of all, it was necessary to know that green lava existed even on Earth, though perhaps not as vivid as this one. Through long and complicated geological processes, subduction and orogeny, for example, conditions favoring the reduction of iron and the appearance of minerals such as chlorite and epidote could indeed give lava this color. Serene, he walked to the shore and dipped his fingertips into the lava as a normal bather would take the temperature of the water. Carmen's eyes widened as she watched him do this, but she refrained from commenting. After all, she had already seen him immolate himself in his own fireplace. shhhhhhhhh. His fingertips instantly began to sizzle, pestilential, opaque fumaroles immediately engulfing him. This lava is toxic, Jake realized as he plugged his nose with his free sleeve. It wasn't just because of the smell that he thought that, but because he could smell that this one wasn't natural. This magma also contained high levels of radiation, and his scan was inoperative on it. But it should do the trick. He concluded with a satisfied look after a few more tests. I suspect this lava is partly produced by energy from the station's reactors. She analyzed. That would explain the radiation, at any rate. Oblivious to Carmen's astonishment, he threw off his clothes and plunged head first into the lava. His head resurfaced a few seconds later, and he took the opportunity to give the vampire some instructions. Watch the galleries. Not really worried that she would try some trickery against him in the pit, especially now that they were separated by lava, Jake submerged himself again and closed his eyes. This lava had a surface temperature of about 2,500 degrees Celsius, which even for him was close to his limit. Deeper down, the temperature climbed to unbearable levels. If he didn't activate his stone skin and forget to direct his constitution and vitality ether to his extremities, he could really die. Even with these precautions, the pain was barely tolerable, but the thought of giving up didn't even cross his mind. His time was limited. He had to make the most of it while he could. Having already thought about his training strategy, Jake didn't just nap, read his manuals, or review his techniques. This time he deployed his spirit body outside his body and used it to absorb heat with. This was the first time he had tried this method, and he bitterly regretted it. Error, cough, cough. The stinging pain made him open his mouth, and he swallowed lava accordingly, nearly choking to death. Fortunately, his Murtharian physique could produce its own oxygen in this hostile environment. As for his digestive system, it had nothing left to prove. He pulled his spirit body back into his brain, using only a few tendrils of mental energy to absorb the outside heat. At the same time, instead of letting his body passively absorb the ambient heat, he made good use of his heat and radiation manipulation to redirect it to his brain. This was also the first time that Jake had favored one organ over another, usually a strong advocate of balanced builds. Focusing all that heat on his gray matter challenged his neurons, and he nearly passed out. If he hadn't mentally prepared himself, he probably would have given up. Gradually, Jake forgot his pain and everything around him, and a long struggle began between his own willpower and the lava threatening to consume him. Disconnected from the world, time flew by without him realizing it, until much later when the robotic voice broke him out of his trance. Chapter 430 Changes in the Village. Both convicts, Jake Wilderth and Carmen Leash, have successfully served their sentences. They will be returned to their respective villages in 3, 2, 1, 0. The pulling force that had dragged them into the abyss did not come from below them this time, but from above. Before Jake had time to gather his wits, he was already out of the lava, soaring some 10 meters above the emerald magma. After spending so much time with his eyes closed in molten rock, he blinked in a daze, unable to acclimate to the dim lighting of the pit. Without the fiery embrace of lava to invigorate him, he felt uncomfortable, like a newborn baby. Nevertheless, Jake was still lucid, and with a mental scan, he got all the information he needed. He didn't notice that he had performed this mind sweep without thinking about it, something he needed to do consciously not so long ago. "Why did you finish off the hunter?" he asked chillingly to the vampire rising into the air beside him with no sign of struggle whatsoever. "I didn't. It killed itself." She shrugged, displeased by his low opinion of her. Staring at the monster's corpse more closely, he did notice that the creature had suffocated itself. Being unable to move in its rock prison, it had apparently managed to stop breathing for long enough to die. Normally, a biological survival reflex prevented people from committing suicide in this manner. It was a feat Jake didn't think he was capable of yet, despite his excellent body control. His desire to live was too strong. Unlike Carmen, who was more than happy to leave this shithole, Jake resisted the anti-gravitational pull with his telekinesis long enough to retrieve his armor and machete. The vampire had been thoughtful enough to fold them near the shore for when he got out, and from the looks of it, she hadn't done anything else. This forced him to re-evaluate his opinion of the young woman. As the invisible force pulled them up, Jake took the opportunity to put on his clothes. For a brief moment, they thought they were going to crash into the ceiling of the cave, but just like the wooden floor of his house, the ceiling opened in two to let them through. The journey up took about as long as their descent into the abyss, and a while later the two survivors were back in the village's central square. A dazzling sun blinded them as soon as they arrived. The artificial star was at its zenith, and Jake immediately caught sight of the crowd staring at them from their bleachers. The daily vote was about to take place, and rather than fretting over their freak status, he paid more attention to the number of absentees. How come there's so few people? Did something happen while we were away? He wondered. You should ask yourself how long you were down there. She chided him gently. You were down in the pit for 5 days. One more day, and Carmine would have tried to suck your blood again. It was only then that Jake noticed how much the vampire had lost. She didn't look sick like the time she tried to bite him, but she wasn't in the best shape either. Regardless, it was no longer his concern. He had kept his end of the deal. If Jake had a flaw, it was that he didn't know how to hold a grudge. It would have been very different if she hadn't tried to drug him to bleed him dry. I fulfilled my part of the contract. You're free to do whatever you want. Jake waved Carmen off before choosing a vacant step to sit on, leaving her to stand at the fountain like a complete stranger. The vampire put on a dejected face, but she didn't stop him from leaving. She, in turn, chose a vacant spot opposite him and waited for the vote to end. Looking around for Kawani, he found the Indian woman heading towards the square with Svara. Both women had heavy bags under their eyes and had also lost a lot of weight. Until proven otherwise, they did not need blood like Carmen to sustain themselves. When they saw him, their eyes almost popped out of their heads, and they ran to him excitedly. You're still alive? It's a miracle. Kawani cried out, pinching him all over with caution as if he might disappear at any moment. She then gave him a playful look and hugged one of his dangling arms, not forgetting to rub her modest chest against it. Stop it, Jake said curtly as he saw her groping him without the slightest restraint. Oh, sorry, I don't know what got into me. The Indian apologized hastily. She then paused on his face, then added, You look different, less human. It was already the case before, but I feel it even more now. It's kind of hot. Jake frowned, but remained silent. He knew exactly what was going on. His psychic training had brought significant changes to his spirit body, but the corruption was the real culprit. They weren't aware of it yet, but it was affecting them too. Kawani was not as tactile a few days ago, and certainly not as bold. She was outgoing, but with an obvious coyness. I told you he was alive. You didn't believe me. Svara complained loudly as she saw the witch acting like everything she'd said before was just a bunch of hot air. Compared to the Native American, the Nawai player was still the same person. If corruption lifted their inhibitions, then it was clear that Svara was innately honest, with no darkness in her heart. How could I take your word for it? Kawani retorted shamelessly. Even if you were telling the truth, no one has ever stayed in the pit this long. I feel a little safer now that he's back. She tried to wrap her arm around him again, but a stern look from Jake stopped her in her tracks. Jake sensed an immense pessimism in the female player's voice beyond her frivolous attitude. What have I been missing the last few days? Where has everyone else gone? They're either dead or qualified for the second round. Kawani revealed with a shudder. Mostly dead. Svara spat without regard for her image. Their reunion had drawn the crowd's attention. Now that there weren't many people left in the round, everyone still alive was being watched closely. Paradoxically, Jake and Carmen's expulsion into the pit had done them a world of good. The natives were no longer as hostile toward him, and Gordon Mason almost had a pleading expression when he looked at him. If he could grovel at his feet and get his forgiveness, the crooked officer would surely have tried. When the two women filled him in on the last few days, he immediately knew what was going on. When Jake and Carmen had been sentenced to the pit, the murders had not stopped. At the same time, the corruption had continued to spread and the crimes had multiplied. The village was now in a precarious state, with the slightest accident likely to degenerate into a pitched battle at any moment. By the morning of the fourth cycle, 2 more murders committed by the monsters had been reported, and 2 more the next morning. Meanwhile, the chosen enforcers had successfully executed the victims of the vote, eliminating 6 unlucky ones who had nothing to do with the nightly killings. It shook everyone up, but apart from Drastin and Avros Valruk, none of the players would have had the guts to go after him anyway. As for the natives, they feared him as much as they revered him. After the Inquisitor's departure, Karl the Confessor, the only person to communicate regularly with him, became the new suspect. It turned out that he had hidden his game well, and he survived the enforcer's pursuit after the villagers voted against him. A new twist was added to the story when the next night, no one died, but a house was burned down. The inhabitant inside had become the first vagabond of the village, forced to spend his nights outside. Needless to say, he didn't last long. He passed away the very next night. As for Karl, he had been exonerated in an unexpected way. Almost convinced that he was one of the monsters, Drastin, the black man in armor, had attacked him in broad daylight, attempting to hack him in half with no warning. The robotic voice had then called him to order, and the hidden function of his barber role had been revealed. The barber could attack one person per cycle, but if that person was not a monster, he would immediately become attackable and lose his privilege. The warrior was now a public enemy, attackable by anyone at any time of day or night. But at least Karl had regained the good graces of the other natives. So why were the remaining villagers so anxious after the Inquisitor left? Because of last night, the 8th night since the round began. With 0 deaths and 1 death respectively on the 6th and 7th nights, 11 villagers had been murdered in the last night alone. The corruption's influence had finally taken its toll on them as well, and none of the survivors here were completely innocent. However, the most anxious of all was Gordon Mason, the bailiff. No one knew why he was so terrified, but ever since Jake left he had been afraid of his own shadow. Rumor had it that he had been attacked on the 3rd night, but the robotic voice had not rewarded him with any reputation points. Counting the victims of the monster murders and those in the pit, the remaining villagers numbered only 27 now, including Jake and Carmen. Chapter 431 at Loggerheads. After the 2 women's account, Jake remained thoughtful for a while. Eventually, he asked coolly, "The 11 dead people from last night, were they killed by the monsters?" Kawani and Svara were somewhat taken aback by his query, but as they replayed the robotic voice's announcement in their memories, they realized that the answer was not all that simple. "I'll say, at least 9, Svara concluded, though she couldn't say for sure. But one of the victims was another vagabond. Since the first house was burned, a house has been destroyed every day. The robotic voice had announced the list of monster victims first before announcing several more murders. To Jake, this could only mean one thing. The monsters had upgraded their role. There was still the possibility, of course, that this was the result of specific cards or that they had held back in the early days, but he rejected the second theory outright. After all, the Inquisitor had left the round as soon as he had reached his kill goal. We need to get our hands on a monster for questioning. But if the number of attacks per night hasn't changed, it can only mean one of 2 things. Either the number of monsters has increased, or the houses being attacked contain several villagers. Jake stated solemnly, "Though, I don't know if the monsters can attack as many times as they want in a house, and we'll have to check. If the number of monsters has increased, let's assume that the original 2 monsters now have the ability to infect other villagers to increase their numbers." The 2 women were surprised by his lack of concern regarding the dire situation, but they refrained from commenting at all. Seeing their offended expressions, Jake felt compelled to justify himself. "You're making a big deal out of nothing. If all the villagers are converted to monsters, we'll all qualify for the next round. There are no real losers. It's much better than dying, and that's probably why the infected villagers agreed to switch sides. But if you're right, that means that out of the remaining 27 participants, there are at least 8 monsters if we assume that their number of attacks per night hasn't changed." Kawani pointed out with a distinct anxiety in her voice. "Actually, there could be more," Jake said matter-of-factly. "Let's assume that we don't know much. But from Gordon's reaction, I think he knows something. My guess is that he doesn't have the same control over the vote as he did in the early days. I'll try to get it out of him after the vote." Before the voting began, he glanced around at the other survivors again, and a thought occurred to him, whereupon he advised, "In the vote to follow, vote against Avros, then on us for the enforcer role." They didn't ask why, but they acquiesced. Jake then took advantage of the short respite to draw the 5 cards he had missed while serving his sentence. Stubbornly, he decisively drew 5 roll and challenge cards with the good intention of drawing the Lord's roll. This time, It seemed that the pit had triumphed over his bad luck, for he drew the Lord's card on the second draw. Perhaps this card wasn't so rare after all, and indeed, the card's contents confirmed his doubts. Villager, Lord, Knight. Upgradable. The Lord can offer to protect other participants against a certain fee. With each new cycle, the Lord can protect an additional person. If the Lord fails to save his protege, he loses his status. Prerequisites: letters of nobility, saving a person from a monster attack, or possessing the Monster Hunter role. This role card was currently of common rarity, but the prerequisites made it problematic to activate. Besides, for most participants this role was completely unnecessary. They had enough trouble keeping themselves safe, and the corruption didn't really promote empathy and helping others. Jake then continued to draw new role cards to further expand his knowledge of the game. This would give him more options if he needed to change his play style, but more importantly, he could better prepare himself for future threats. There was nothing worse than not knowing what the enemy was capable of. This collection of roles solved some of that problem. In total, his deck now included 10 cards, 7 of which were roles. Most of the cards drawn were production roles like farmer and miner, or craft roles like baker and mason. Miner and mason turned out to be much more interesting than he had originally believed, causing him to rethink his strategy, but it was the last card drawn that made his day. Traveler, legendary, can wander around outside and everywhere, including at night. He can knock on other houses. Prerequisite: traveler's boots and cape. It was a good card. No doubt getting the equipment set would not be so easy, but the very existence of this card meant a lot. With his cards drawn, Jake finally took a look at his new status. Ether status. Strength, S 324.7 points. 300.7 greater than 324.7. Agility, A 315.3 points. 286.8 greater than 315.3. Constitution, C 333 points. 317 greater than 333. Vitality, V 329.8 points. 315.2 greater than 329.8. Intelligence, I 426.6 points. 298 greater than 426.6. Perception, P 341.4 points. 257.6 greater than 341.4. Extrasensory perception, EP 400.2 points. 302 greater than 400.2. Ether core, 191 points. 188 greater than 191 points. Body status. Physique, silver Mertherian body, LVL2. Height, 2.54 meters. 2.53, 2.54 meters. Weight, 491 kilograms. 486 greater than 491 kilograms. Strength, 215 points. 203 greater than 215. Agility, 101 points. 96 greater than 101. Constitution, 235.2 points. 203.5 greater than 235.2. Vitality, 228.5 points. 202.3 greater than 228.5. Intelligence, 154.9 points. 115.8 greater than 154.9. Perception, 167.5 points. 116.2 greater than 167.5. Soul status, Mertherian soul LVL2, heat, earth, radiation attributes. For soul glyphs, a fish in water, apex predator, extreme diver, harbinger of chaos. Spirit body LVL14, 11 greater than 14. Ghost, its density is such that the spirit body begins to have tangible effects on the physical world and can temporarily separate itself from its carnal envelope. Out-of-body journeys are now possible, but keeping in mind that in this form the soul is extremely vulnerable and the physical body abandoned in a state of clinical death. The soul is now partially resistant to heat and radiation and can extract a portion of the energy it contains. His spirit body especially had gone straight from level 11 to 14, which made him realize that he had been training incorrectly all this time. His spirit body and soul needed to be tempered too in order to evolve. Just raising his mental stats was obviously not enough. For some reason, he didn't feel much different. What was certain, however, was that he had regained his equanimity. The unhealthy emotionality caused by the corruption seemed to give him a break for the moment. After that, the robotic voice announced the start of the vote. Jake made no attempt to influence the outcome. With his eyes closed, he simply waited for the result after turning in his ballot. The survivors present showed different behaviors. While the players were calm like Drastin and Peter Brady, some of the natives seemed to be extremely nervous. The bailiff was one of these people, but Carl also had a gloomy look on his face. Jake also recognized Susan Byrne, the busted soldier who had been sexually harassed the first few days. Now that she was being left alone, she stood back with a scowl on her face. There was also Laxmini, the rookie who had calmed the terrified enforcer youth chosen to fight him, the warrior Daryl, and a few other natives he remembered. Speaking of the frightened youth that Laxmini had placated, he was nowhere in sight. Yet, the two individuals who caught his attention the most were two lone players. The first one was Avros, the Australian with the surfer's look that he had been suspicious of since the beginning. His attitude hadn't changed. He was as relaxed and frivolous as ever, but because of the drop in the number of ladies, he had stopped winking at everything. Instead, his face wore an amused smile, showing off his perfect white teeth. The second was an austere woman with tousled black hair, wearing a long white dress. She was barefoot, and her feet were black with dirt. With Kawani's past description, he identified her as Ostrexera Damon, the player she had urged them to vote against. The noon vote took place in the village square. The villagers present voted against Avros Valruk, Hephis Vist, and Luke Wham, suspecting them of being monsters. Please choose 3 new enforcers. Avros Valruk retains his role. Gordon, Carl, and a few other natives erupted with joy at the verdict, while Avros Valruk lost his smile for the first time. Rising to his feet, the Australian gave the sobbing natives a hostile glare that made their blood run cold. All of a sudden, he began to applaud. Well done, Gordon. Even a rat, when cornered, can bare its teeth. Alas, I'm afraid you don't know what a huge mistake you just made. Tonight. Well, you'll find out for yourself in a few moments. With these words, without waiting for the next vote, the surfer broke into a sprint. He leapt over a building and disappeared behind it before anyone could stop him. Boom. A few minutes later, an explosion sounded somewhere in the village in front of a stunned crowd. Then Gordon fell to his knees with a horrified expression and began to bawl his eyes out. Chapter 432 First Hunt. Among the other two voted, Hephis Vist was an Aegean player who had already stood out for his survival on the first night. The fact that he was voted guilty today showed that public opinion had changed dramatically during his 5-day absence. Apparently, this man didn't care about these votes, and Jake had actually never seen him since day 1. According to Kawani, he had striking black eyes and always hid his features under a hood or mask. As for the last one, Luke Wham, he was a complete stranger and had quietly slipped away at the same time as Avros. The other villagers may have missed their exchange of glances, but Jake did not. These two players knew each other. Gordon and the rest of his slimmed-down native clique were biting their fingernails in trepidation, and with his flair, Jake immediately sensed that there was an opportunity here. Startling the two women beside him, he stood up and walked to the square's center before facing the small crowd. He then cleared his throat and declared aggressively, "I want the enforcer role." Seeing that some of the natives were about to protest, he took the lead. "Hold on. I'm not done yet. If you give me this role, I promise you 2 things. I will take care of Avros, and I will protect anyone who is willing to receive my protection." Turning to Carl, the confessor, Jake gestured for him to come over and commanded, "Ask me what my role is." "What is your first role, Jake Wilderth?" Carl questioned him bluntly. At that very moment, golden runes materialized around the two men and linked together to form a kind of bond. Jake probed the glowing runes around him with his mind and came to the conclusion that it was akin to an oracle contract. Under these circumstances, lying would be considered an infraction. "Villager, Forest Warden," Jake replied coolly, without showing any sign of jitters or hesitation. Upon hearing his answer, the natives who had been holding their breath from apprehension exhaled loudly in relief. At least this monster was on their side. The group of natives then took a few minutes to whisper among themselves before accepting his proposal. The other 2 enforcers chosen were neither Kawani nor Svara, but Drastin, formerly Barbier, and Peter Brady, who was missing. Jake was surprised at the last choice, but Daryl the healer and Carl had certified to know his role. He was reliable, but because his role was a SE and SIV subject, they had sworn not to reveal it to others. Hearing the robotic voice speak his name, Jake yawned. I'm finally going to have some fun. He then explained to Kawani and Svara his intention to protect the volunteers for a fee and left them to handle the negotiations. Currently, Kawani and Svara were also among these volunteers. They had already planned to spend the night together after last night's massacre. By the way, the message on his wooden sign was still standing in front of his door, and everyone knew about the deal he had signed with Carmen. Many had been shocked when they heard the announcement that she had attacked him 4 nights earlier, but when they saw them reappear together, they were reassured. Jake then waved goodbye to the crowd and decided to go on the hunt. It was not out of altruism that he wanted this role, but simply because he had fallen behind on his plans. Kawani and Svara were now richer than he was. It was Carmen, in comparison, who was not proactive enough. It seemed that the only important thing for the vampire was to get her dose of hemoglobin. He didn't care if Avros, Luke, or Hephis were guilty or not. All that mattered was that by defeating them, he could then extort their precious fluid. It would also be a good pretext to worm something out of them. Once far from the central plaza, Jake stopped putting on a relaxed attitude and pulled out his machete. With a thought, he began to search for the 3 criminals one by one, starting with Avros, and his shadow guide fluctuated accordingly. Alas, after a few steps his ghostly double became motionless and refused to move again. Prediction doesn't work on Hephis and Avros, she told him succinctly after the procedure had failed a second time. Jake suppressed his annoyance and shifted his focus to the only remaining target, Luke Wham. As he saw the shadow guide heading in a certain direction, he regained some enthusiasm. It works. He had feared that the corruption might have rendered the Oracle system inoperative, but that was apparently not the case. The 2 players were therefore of equal or higher rank than he was. He found this hard to believe, but there was also the possibility that they had used an Oracle skill like Oracle cloaking or promotion. In no hurry, he retraced his steps and examined the house behind which Avros had vanished. The Australian had been careful, but moving at his speed, it was impossible not to leave traces. In front of Jake's sharp senses, no detail could escape him, and with his intelligence he could practically reproduce the scene before his eyes. An imprint on a paved stone, a crushed blade of grass, a cracked tile, and a moment later he found himself in front of the house that had just exploded. On the door, broken in 1,000 pieces, he recognized the initials of Gordon Mason. The duplicate keys of the villagers supposedly in his possession were gone, and he hoped that this idiot officer was carrying them with him. The explosion made it difficult for him to track down Avros, but Avros was clearly a little too cocky. To retrieve the villagers' keys, he had carelessly searched the rubble, leaving his footprints all over the ash layer. The ash still stuck to his feet had then betrayed the direction he had fled. Unsurprisingly, the player had left the village, and his tracking led him to the mountain where the mine was located. So, this is where you want to ambush me? Jake wondered inwardly. Coincidence or not, his shadow guide told him that Luke Wham was also in the area. One didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes to suspect that Hephis Vist was part of their team. Even if he was not, it was better to assume the worst. To his delight, he didn't have to look for them for long. Unlike Chinin and Svara's failed ambush, these 3 targets didn't even try to hide. The 3 men sitting on a large rock prominently displayed at the entrance to the mine. Gee, so you're the one they chose to send into the fray? Avros taunted as he chewed on a tobacco leaf. Seems like it. Jake smiled politely. The 2 sides silently examined each other before Avros broke the silence again. You better give up while you still can, he declared benevolently. I know Peter, he won't come. As for Drastin, he knows the risks. Jake squinted his eyes, but continued to smile. Drastin, you mean the villager immunity he lost when he attacked Carl? Jake scoffed. If he comes here, he won't just be attacked by you 3, am I right? Avros's face darkened, his benevolent facade nowhere in sight. As soon as he stood up, his 2 companions stood up in turn and drew their weapons. Hephis was as described, a man hooded in black with a look reminiscent of the assassins from Assassin's Creed. He was armed to the teeth, with a short sword in each hand. It was easy to see why the monster's attack on him had failed the first night. Luke Wham had an eccentric look, a disharmonious mix between a Latin cowboy and a steampunk gentleman. He wore a faded orange frock coat, a black bowler hat, and a silver monocle, but the rest of his outfit was much more casual. His leather boots were well worn, and it was legitimate to wonder if the gray of his shirt was genuine or an ACCU emulation of grime. He, too, was armed to the teeth, but more into firearms. The player was currently pointing a huge blunderbuss straight at his heart. Far from being intimidated by this demonstration, Jake instead felt a surge of excitement. After 5 days of suffering in the lava, he was in dire need of a stretch. The air seemed to distort near him, and small gravels began to gravitate around him, as if gravity had disappeared. But what struck the 3 players the most was the total silence, as if they had just put on a pair of earplugs. For the first time, they became aware of the formidable opponent in front of them. Giving up on testing him, they realized that staying alive was going to be the challenge of the next few hours. By unspoken agreement, He-Fi's disappeared, leaving a trail of dark smoke in his wake, and Jake promptly tilted his CHESD to escape a rain of darts. Simultaneously, Luke Wham opened fire, and a telekinetic barrier intercepted the projectile, leaving a ripple on its surface. Jake then grabbed the 2 sticks of dynamite on the fly without looking and threw them back at his owner, but a third stick exploded beside him. A detonation rang out, and a cloud of smoke obscured the battlefield. Gunfire and the clash of swords interspersed with explosions continued to echo through the opaque fog before silence returned a few minutes later. When the smoke cleared, Jake was left alone in front of the mine, in the middle of a macabre scene. However, except for a severed arm holding a blunderbuss, there were no bodies of the other 3 men. They had taken advantage of the smoke to escape. Chapter 433 Last night. Jake's first instinct was to pick up the severed arm to absorb the liquid alloy. Tisk, wrong arm. Jake tooted in a grumpy mood. You just can't get lucky every time. She stated the obvious without the slightest hint of sympathy for his setback. Luke Wham was apparently right-handed, and it was regrettably his left arm in his hands. He then proceeded to check the blunderbuss from all angles, but found that the weapon was nothing special. Compared to his own assault rifle, it was a primitive shotgun. They were good, Jake declared as he looked down the path they had escaped to. Whether it was Luke, Avros, or He-Fi's, they were top-tier players. Their agility, coordination, reflexes, strength, and accuracy were excellent compared to the majority of contestants, while their mental state left nothing to be desired either. If it had been a different person than him, like Sarah or Kyle, they would have died without a doubt. Above all, they had all managed to escape. Jake was now sure He-Fi's and Avros were using an oracle cloaking, or their oracle ranks rivaled his. Despite his advantage in speed and strength, he had never really managed to gain an advantage over these 2. As for Luke, he was slightly below them, but with the help of the other 2 he had put in a decent performance. He-Fi's was an Aegean assassin specializing in the shadow element, while Avros kept his true abilities concealed behind his dynamite. Even though he seemed to have won this first exchange, Jake knew how close this fight had come. Still, he had won the first round, and that was a good starting point for winning the next. Let's get back to the hunt. Jake whistled blithely. He recalibrated his oracle path, and his shadow guide started running in the direction of the footprints. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. Less than a minute later, the robotic voice put a hasty end to his project. He-Fi's Vist, Luke Wham, and Avros Valruk have qualified for the next round and have decided to assert their rights. They will be transported out of the village in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 0. A few minutes earlier, someplace on the other side of the mountain, Luke Wham collapsed against a fir tree, his face drenched in sweat. He was missing his left arm, cut clean off at the shoulder. He was short of breath, and his crooked face betrayed the immense pain he was in. Fuckng hell. That bastard didn't miss me. The gentleman cowboy began to spill out all the insults in his arsenal before running out of breath. He wanted to continue, but stabilizing his wound with ether was already getting his full attention. Once his wound was bandaged, he growled. What was that freak? We're supposed to be the monsters here, right? Why am I more afraid of him than you? You are mistaken. He-Fi's gave him a sympathetic look. You are scared of him. And on the other hand, I am not a monster. Yeah, you picked the assassin's role, so what? In the end, You kill one person every night. Just like us. Wrong. The Shadow Mage quipped with his finger. I don't have to kill anyone. I kill because I want to. Faced with his companion's shamelessness, the one-armed man snorted and decided to pretend he didn't exist. Turning to Avros, he asked, "What do we do now? If he can find us once, he can find us again. Sure, you can abandon me, but I doubt you have enough ether to keep the Oracle cloaking until nightfall." The Australian, who was smoking a cigarette nearby, threw his butt into a bush and watched the fire start with great fascination before sighing. "We have no choice. We've got enough fluid already. I was hoping to accumulate more, but it's a sin to be too greedy." Hephies and Luke facepalmed. Avros could have left since the 5th cycle, but he had stayed there to get more. Right now, he was probably the Rick.H.E.S.T villager in this round. How does a sociopath like you stay so calm? Luke made no secret of his awe. "If I'm not mistaken, you haven't committed any infractions so far, have you? Are you more sane than all of us put together, or do you just have better self-control?" Avros lost interest in the burning bush and cracked an evil smile. "I'm not sane. I'm insane. I always have been. But unlike the rest of you, I'm used to it. I don't live in denial of my vices." All of a sudden, Avros and Hephies looked up in the same direction and their expressions changed. "There's no time. He's on his way. See you later." Before returning to the village, Jake first inspected the last place where the 3 players had stayed. There he found the bailiff's spare keys, abandoned in the grass next to a burnt bush that was still smoking. The runes had apparently stopped the fire from spreading. Jake then walked back the way he came and a few moments later arrived at his house. He was surprised to find a group of people in front of his home. Remembering what he had requested of Kawani and Svara, he determined that they must have succeeded in persuading them, but the reality was entirely different. The negotiation had been a failure, but the departure of the 3 players had changed everything. The remaining villagers had finally found their hero. Before that, they had pinned their hopes on Drastin, the black man in armor, but he had been disappointing so far. Now, the said player was locked up in his house and was content to wait for the end of the round. Some said he was afraid of Avros and the other monsters, but the truth was that he too was trying to resist the corruption. With no better solution, the best thing to do was to maintain his peace of mind, preferably in an unstimulating environment. Nevertheless, Jake didn't care about his mishaps. With the marketing done by the 2 women and the recent publicity the robotic voice had brought him, he had no trouble extorting the residents. Except for Peter Brady, Drastin, Ostrexera, Kawani, Carmen, and Svara, all the remaining villagers were natives, namely 14 natives and 6 players. Unlike the players' contracts, it was harder to negotiate with these people without a proper role. Having the dominant position, Jake asked to be paid up front as proof of their good faith. His argument was that if he felt like killing them and stealing their fluid, he was 100% confident that he could kill them before being sent back to the pit. The memory of how he had escaped his first punishment was still fresh in their minds, so his argument hit home. Laxmini was an unimportant recruit, but according to Kawani, she had spent most of her time with Ostrexera, and they could be considered friends. Ostrexera was extremely mysterious and reclusive, and it had been a surprise to everyone when she had accepted the native by her side. More than one thought that she was secretly a lesbian, being bitter and cold only towards men. As most of the natives had given up on earning 50M, they all agreed to pay her the 5M fee for protection, for a total amount of 55M units. Some grumbled a little, but in the end the fear of being the next to die convinced them all. At that moment, Jake realized that he would have in his house tonight 14 of the 20 remaining villagers, including Kawani, Svara, and Carmen. The vampire had agreed to join them, but had not asked for protection. Knowing her abilities, Jake didn't refuse. Statistically, there was a significant chance that one or more of these people would be part of the monsters, but that was exactly what he wanted. What had tipped him off was Gordon and Carl's refusal to mix with the other natives. Their backgrounds were not a good enough reason to explain their reaction. So Jake played along and accepted everyone without exception. He returned to the forest to collect some herbs and finish his preparations, then returned home at dusk. Getting everyone into his tiny building proved to be a challenge, but with a little bit of stuffing, they all managed to fit inside. However, Jake had to reposition them personally. to make sure he was able to intervene immediately if anything went wrong. In the end, he managed to keep them all in the same room with at least a meter of distance separating them from each other. Everyone was leaning against the sides of the wall, forming a square in the center of which stood Jake, Carmen, Svara, and Kawani. This was the first night that Jake did not go into his fireplace to practice. He didn't light it either, and kept his eyes wide open and his mind alert. With his Murtharian eyes, nothing could escape him, and the darkness would blind his enemies. For the first few hours, except for the groans of pain from the villagers and the floor squeaking as they shifted positions to relieve their backs or legs, nothing disturbed them. Chapter 434 Monsters. Those who were sleeping were jolted awake by the pounding on the door, while Jake and the 3 female players got into fighting position. With their player perception, none of them had trouble seeing in the dark. Walking cautiously toward the door, his blade in hand, Jake shouted, "Who is it?" If it was a monster, they were supposed to be able to destroy the door, or no monster attack would have succeeded the previous nights. Still, the possibility that it was a diversion was not to be discounted. "It's Peter." A tired voice sounded from the other side. "I have something to say. I know who the monsters are." The image of a young player addicted to drugs and jaded to everything came to mind. He was curious how the walls of his house could block out all outside sounds, but at the same time allow the villager's voice on the other side to filter through. Jake didn't ask him who the monsters were, because he already had a much more plausible suspect in front of him. "If you're not a monster yourself, then how come you're out at night?" He probed him, not taking his guard off. There was a short silence where Peter seemingly pondered his options, after which he answered, "Let's say I'm a monster. What would that change?" Jake's brow furrowed, but he quickly loosened up. It didn't matter if Peter was a monster or not. As long as he stayed out, he had no reason to pick on him. "So who are these monsters?" he asked. Telepathically, he relayed, "Think the answer in your head." "I've identified 3, Susan Byrne, Daryl Fischel, and..." When Jake heard the last name, a cold shiver ran down his spine. However, his acting had progressed well, and he managed to cover it up. Peter having thought the reply, no sound had come out of his mouth, and Jake took advantage of it to confuse the matter. "Why don't you speak? If you have nothing to say, get the fuck out, or I shall treat you as my enemy." He yelled harshly with overbearing hostility. At the same time, he told him telepathically, "Let me handle the situation. We'll talk later." "Very well. Since I'm not welcome, I'll leave. Don't regret your choice." The junkie hurled a final threat, and then turned tail and walked away. Without warning and in pitch blackness, he reversed his grip on his sword and stabbed at the shadow behind him. A spray of gray blood splattered on the floor and walls as his blade came out of its back. The villager, who was leaning against the opposite wall, was sprayed with blood and immediately started screaming. Jake felt his victim's claws clench in pain around his neck, but he ducked with a jerk of his shoulder, followed by a backward headbutt. The monster collapsed to the ground, his face completely pulverized. Jake then turned around, ready to face his assailant, but was taken aback when he discovered the culprit. He was a Titan Pearl engineer, and a very ordinary one at that. Nearly retired, he officially had the role of fishmonger, and Jake knew he had a wife and 2 kids from chatting with him on the first day. "You're not the one I was expecting," he said with some disappointment, tinged with relief. At that moment, the softness of his features hardened, replaced by a palpable rage. Then, he turned his head towards one of the young women at his side and uttered word by word in an icy tone. "Isn't it Kawani? Or should I say, one of the monsters? Which in monster, you have hidden it well." The native Indian woman's face sank as she felt his great disappointment. She reflexively stepped back and pointed her spear at him. The other villagers immediately shrank away from her, as if she were infected with leprosy. "Listen to me, Jake. It's not what you think." She defended herself with an aggrieved look. "I am one of the monsters, but I didn't attack anyone. I can swear to that." Of course, Jake would never give the slightest credence to an oral promise. In his eyes, even the oracle contracts could barely be trusted. "How could you keep this from us?" Svara gasped with a horrified expression. She was having a hard time coping with this. "To think I was planning to sleep in the same house as you after last night's bloodbath." In comparison, Carmen maintained her icy poise, only having eyes for Jake. "She shouldn't be lying." "I think so. Maybe. I don't know. The vampire chipped in with waning assurance. But how much longer will she resist? Jake retorted without a shred of mercy. You know very well how these roles work and this village's influence on our instincts. If she wants to survive, she will have no choice but to embrace her new nature. He then gave her an ultimatum. If you are truly innocent, sign a contract. Kawani's frail stature drooped as she heard his cruel words. She knew full well what kind of contracts he was talking about. Unlike Svara, she knew what men were capable of when they had all the power over another's soul. She would rather die than take that risk. I can't do this. Find another way. She flatly refused. I don't see any, unless you have enough points to qualify for the next round. In that case, let's fight. May the better one win. Kawani gritted her teeth, now convinced that the confrontation was inevitable. As she aimed her spear at him this time, a mirage of a gigantic golden prairie chicken appeared behind her. Feathers grew on her bare arms and legs, while her hands took on the appearance of talons. Her fleshy lips and jaw protruded into a curved beak, while an unsightly crest sprang up in the middle of her head, splitting her hair in two. At that moment, a raucous and hysterical laugh interrupted the drama. Simultaneously, the owner of this same voice started to howl in agony. Eric, how did you know? Susan croaked as she looked at the empty spot in her chest where her heart once was. Across from her, Carmen held the vital organ between her fingers, eliciting the blood dripping from the arteries with delight. Jake was surprised at the vampire's responsiveness, but he didn't take offense. Since he'd been hanging out with her, he knew she had a way of identifying other monsters. Why she had waited all this time to take action was beyond him. Nonetheless, this incident was the final straw that set off the hostilities. Aware that their identity as monsters had been revealed, the affected villagers gave up all pretenses. For the first time, Jake and the other survivors experienced the full range of abilities that this role entailed. Susan, who was missing a heart and one of her huge breasts, did not die immediately, quite the opposite. Her crazy giggle returned and her countenance began to change. Her pupils slit and her blue eyes turned white. Her slender fingers fused into a metallic blade and her spine lengthened, followed by her bones cracking. The bloody heart in Carmen's hands turned gray and spine shot out of it, piercing the vampire's hand all the way through. Then the heart flew back to its former home. What the? Carmen instantly released her blood aura and a torrent of reddish energy enveloped her body. Before Susan could complete her transformation, her head was ripped off by a violent swipe of her claw. The girl's carcass rolled to the ground, spilling gallons of gray blood, which triggered another wave of panicked screams from the unfortunate ones being sprayed. It should not be forgotten that during all this time it was pitch black. Carmen's bloody aura was ominous in the middle of this darkness. Meanwhile, the other monsters had taken the opportunity to complete their morphing. Their original faces were still recognizable, but their morphology had become grotesque and distorted, the result being very similar to the hunters who had chased them not so long ago. In this form they were unaware of it, but their sadistic and cruel expressions betrayed a transformation that went far beyond their appearance. But what set off alarm bells in Jake's head was their ability to change the shape of their limbs to form various deadly weapons. This uncanny ability reminded him of the digesters without any mistaking. This role is a poison gift, Jake suddenly realized. It gave them more freedom and an overpowered fighting form, but it doomed them to the night. As he was counting them, Jake realized that one was missing, the most important one. Where's Daryl? Searching for him with his eyes, he finally found the Titan Pearl's head doctor among the monsters. Curiously, he hadn't transformed. He was still the same friendly-looking 50-year-old with a Kadogan haircut and fingers yellowed by nicotine. Except this time, a sinister, gloomy energy was seeping out of his body. I underestimated Peter. The healer sighed as he slipped on a pair of latex gloves. With his addiction and secret, I thought he would have known how to hold his tongue. But it doesn't matter. Killing you all has always been my plan from the beginning. Chapter 4, 35:10 seconds. The Titan Pearl's doctor then opened a flap of his officer's trench coat, revealing the numerous carbon tubes hanging from his leather belt. Slowly, he unclipped his coat and let it fall to the ground, revealing an ordinary soldier's uniform. but loose and stretchy enough to accommodate any movement. "You're a fluid wielder," Jake said with no change of expression. He had already braced himself for this eventuality, since Avi Shanmin's bodyguards were themselves fluid masters on a tail. Even on Earth, military personnel with specific training such as doctors or surgeons had officer status by default. This did not truly grant them authority, but the rank was nonetheless valid. In a world where authority was synonymous with power, being a fluid wielder was a sure way to achieve and maintain social status. As the Titan Pearl was the 23rd expedition to Riva, there was no doubt that the consortium knew that none of the previous expeditions had ever made it to their destination. Following this logic, the Titan Pearl had been bolstered accordingly, and the very presence of the players was the best evidence of this. Jake didn't know if any of the natives of this world were capable of mobilizing the Oracle's forces, but it wasn't all that absurd. Indeed, Fluid Master Daryl Fischel, at your service. The doctor did not deny his statement. Basically, I was just a dormant spy for the First Brotherhood, tasked with keeping an eye on the Shanmin clan's heir. If the trip had gone as planned, Avi would have made a mistake sooner or later, and we would have replaced her with one of our own. Sadly, nothing goes as planned on this expedition, and I was forced to make certain choices to survive. Now, even if I were to surrender, it is likely that the Consortium would send me to the Inquisition to be reformed. Becoming an Inquisitor is the dream of many fools, but when you know as much as I do, let's just say being a criminal isn't so bad after all. The few non-monster natives present listened to his speech with growing bewilderment, while a marked surprise was also apparent amidst the sadistic grins of the monsters. Who would have thought that a simple ship's doctor could hide so many secrets? Many of the Titan Pearl soldiers had been treated by him over the past few years, and he had always been beyond reproach in terms of ethics and character. Aside from his nicotine addiction, he was an honest man. At least, that's what everyone thought. Now that the introductions are done, let's get it over with, shall we? Daryl proclaimed with a sly smile as he grabbed one of the tubes from his belt. Once in his hand, the object lengthened to form a sort of wand about 50 centimeters long, wide at the handle and thin as a twig at the end. At once, this end began to sparkle like a star, and a thunderous rumble broke out in the small house. For a split second, the flash of white light illuminated the interior of the room, and all the natives blinded by the darkness got to see the actual situation around them. The panic suddenly escalated, with shrill screams of terror easily covering the weapon's thunderous roar. In the throes of chaos, some even tried to escape through the door, only to remember that they would be sent to the pit if they did so. In the end, they were forced to cower in the corners of the room, hoping not to be noticed. Don't underestimate the fluid wielders after defeating Avi. She's just a common fluid knight. Daryl warned him condescendingly. Thanks, but you better worry about your own safety. Jake replied unmoved. He was tired of these cartoonish, cliched villains. If he'd had a little more objectivity, he would have realized that he was behaving exactly the same way as his enemy, but he'd always been a hypocrite. All of a sudden, a long streak of white lightning shot out from the wand, blinding everyone present. The attack was easily dodged, but the flash was the catalyst for the other monsters to spring into action. Simultaneously, two monsters leaped at Svara, while the last two caught Carmen in a vice-like grip. Jake braced himself thinking he was Daryl's target, but when the lightning bolt faded he realized he had been fooled. The doctor was nowhere in sight, and a spark to his left told him that Svara had been targeted. He only managed to create a telekinetic barrier between the two, and a second deadly bolt of lightning struck the force field, electrified crackles running along the obstacle. TSK. Not bad, but you haven't seen anything yet. Daryl sneered as he continued to slalom like an untraceable shadow. Dark energy began to converge on his body, and his speed increased exponentially. At this point, even Jake could barely keep up with him. If the house wasn't reinforced with runes, the impact of his feet on the ground would have blown it apart. In the blink of an eye, the fluid master whirled around the room like a hurricane, and with the exception of Carmen and Jake, everyone was slashed to different levels. The most shocking part of it all was that his subsonic movements produced neither sound nor wind. Unwilling to fail on the first day of his grand protection project, Jake had no choice but to grit his teeth and go all out. That meant spending astronomical amounts of ether and fluid, and with that came corruption. 10 seconds. Jake said to himself. That was how long he allowed himself to end the fight. His body burst into flames, and a searing heat erupted from his body. Bloodline ignition on. In order not to incinerate his allies and the innocents under his protection, Jake controlled the heat released for the first time and internalized it into his own body. This was the first time he had ever performed such a dangerous operation, and he felt a tremendous pressure hammering at his skull. If his spirit body had not been strengthened recently, focusing the temperature like this would have damaged it. Daryl doubted for the first time. With his experience and superhuman foreknowledge, he put his wand away and grabbed 2 more tubes instead. The first formed a full body armor of energy runes and metal, while the second formed a huge rectangular steel shield 4 inches thick. A dark energy shield coated the structure for added defense. 4 more tubes levitated around him to form additional shields, and they interlocked in a choreographed fashion. Under this turtle formation, the Fluid Master was confident that he could survive even an orbital cannon shot. Unfortunately, it wasn't an orbital cannon shot, but Jake. As soon as Jake swung his machete, his fate was sealed. If Daryl could silently rip everyone apart while moving like a shadow, Jake was the exact opposite. Telekinetic shields insulated his allies from the coming deluge, and then he struck with all his might. Far from being a shadow, it was a comet as blinding as the sun that atomized the wooden room like a meteor. A tornado of blazing light ravaged the remaining monsters in a split second, Jake's machete mauling them into hundreds of pieces in a supersonic blast. The house's walls and floor that had remained intact until now began to crumble. 9 seconds. Jake noticed that the natives turned into monsters effortlessly withstood the scorching heat of his blade, which should have incinerated them. Worse, it accelerated their wound regeneration. The monster roll is indeed based on parasites. In that case, a shrill grinding noise leaked out of his blade, and the slaughter resumed in earnest. This time, no monster escaped. Parasite or not, digester or not, corrupted or not, he butchered them all without exception. 8 seconds. Only Daryl was left beneath his fluid artifacts formation. Scanning the room, he saw Kawani lying in her own blood, Svara struggling to get up with the help of her axe, and Carmen staring at him like a starving child at a pizza. With his hearing, he could tell right away that Kawani was dying. Her heart had stopped beating, and her half-human, half-chicken form had resorbed. I can take care of it, Svara said telepathically. Jake nodded and deactivated the force field isolating her from his attacks. 6 seconds. Raising his blade, he swung it down at the shield wall in front of him with all his weight. The structure caved in, but stood firm. The deep gash through the metal resorbed the next second, as if it were some kind of shape memory metal. 5 seconds. 4 seconds. The shield formation shattered, revealing Daryl and his armor huddled inside. Seeing Jake's predatory gaze, the veteran Fluid Master finally felt the call of the Reaper. Out of sheer survival instinct, he brandished the last tube in his possession to form an energy blade, and his free hand reached for the fluid card in his pocket. Seeing him fiddle with his fluid card, Jake instantly understood his intent. I won't let you do it. Jake swung his machete one last time with unstoppable momentum. The doctor did not panic. A flood of dark energy infused his veins at the last moment, increasing his physical strength, and his blade clashed against his own. Just before impact, his body ballooned into a monstrous form. 3 seconds. An arm and a leg were flung into the air. Against Jake's overwhelming power, Daryl's futile efforts had not been nearly enough. Yet, at the crucial moment he had leaned to the side, avoiding a fatal injury. When Jake tried to end it all, Daryl grinned victoriously and vanished. Right afterwards, the robotic voice resounded above him, acknowledging the doctor's qualification for the next round. Chapter 436, End of the First Round, Part 1. Congratulations to Jake Wilderth for eliminating the monsters. Jake gains 4 reputation points. Congratulate Carmen Leash on eliminating monster Susan Byrne. Carmen gains 1 reputation point. A series of announcements followed Daryl's departure, saluting their victory with well-deserved reputation points. Yet, Jake ignored the robotic voice to focus on the severed arm and leg before him. Thinking back to Daryl's victorious grin, He couldn't help but smirk to himself. While the Fluid Master was reveling in the glory of having survived, Jake had surreptitiously channeled his telekinesis to snatch his fluid card. He was willing to bet that the old doctor would be bawling his eyes out in a few minutes. Of course, he didn't check the content straight away. He first collected the other fluid cards, as well as any items in the monster's possession that he thought might be useful. He didn't stop Carmen from rifling through Susan's pockets either, even when she pulled out a strange parchment covered in golden runes. Hearing Kawani cough behind him, he also learned that the Native American woman had somehow made it through. Despite the severity of her injuries, Svara had indeed managed to pull her back from the brink of death. "Don't ask," the Nawai woman pleaded vainly as she felt his inquisitive gaze upon her. "I don't need to ask," Jake snickered. Without a shred of empathy, he accessed her oracle status and checked her logbook as well as her ether skills and bloodlines. He already knew she had assimilated some sort of Valkyrie bloodline, but he hadn't looked at her skills in depth. After all, what could he possibly fear from a slave woman unable to disobey whom he had already defeated? Life and death reversal? Jake probed after reading everything. Yes. She looked down in disappointment. Her biggest secret had been revealed, just like that. "Good skill," Jake commented before turning his attention to Kawani. In Norse mythology, the Valkyries were minor deities who served Odin, master of the gods. The Valkyries, clad in armor, flew, led battles, distributed death among warriors, and took the heroes' souls to Valhalla, Odin's great palace, to become Einherjar. These heroines were destined to fight alongside Odin at the advent of Ragnarok. In modern art, the Valkyries were sometimes described as beautiful maidens riding Pegasus, adorned with helmets and armed with spears. However, the Valkyrie steed was not a Pegasus, contrary to some stereotypes. Rather, their mounts were hordes of wolves that roamed among the bodies of dead warriors. These wolves were gruesome fighters. While the wolf was the mount of the Valkyrie seemed to be related to the raven, an animal that frequently appeared in Norse mythology and was known to hover over battlefields. With the oracle, it was impossible for a Valkyrie to be in the service of Odin or another Norse earth god. Nonetheless, as with his first ordeal inspired by ancient Rome, there were some commonalities. Svara's Valkyrie bloodline was grade 6, level 1. Unlike Jake's grade 8 bloodline, her ether and body stats did not have a higher growth potential than a normal human, but she did have a fixed bonus that multiplied her body strength, agility, constitution, and vitality by a factor of 6. Depending on the individual, this type of bloodline with fixed bonuses could even be superior to higher-grade bloodlines. For example, currently Jake's Murtharian body only increased the value of his stats by a factor of 4 while his bloodline was already 1 level higher. Of course, this did not mean that Svara was stronger than him. If a sedentary Valkyrie had body stats of 10, as opposed to 30 for a world-class athlete, that would effectively allow them to compete in theory against a human with 60 and 180 body stats respectively. The problem was that, like humans, they could not train their bodies beyond these fundamental biological limits. There was a limit of height, muscles, etc., that could not be exceeded by sheer effort. Jake, on the other hand, could transform and evolve his body without any limits. Just by taking his body strength, for example, which had reached 215 points, he could compete in brute strength against a human with 860 points. Of course, such a human had no chance of existing. However, it was not these perks that interested him, but rather the ether skills that went with them. In line with what was expected of a Valkyrie, this bloodline allowed to safeguard the souls of the deceased, and were therefore essential to their existence. Life and death reversal was precisely one of these skills that allowed the soul of a deceased person to be reintroduced into their body before it dissipated. For this to work, the original body had to be regenerated or a new vessel had to be provided. With the vitality ether, this was easily done. Unconcerned about the other villagers still alive, Jake crouched beside Kawani, waiting for her to regain consciousness. She had lost a lot of blood fighting her enemy, and even at the cost of her life, she hadn't turned into a monster. It was worth thinking about. At first, he wanted to heal her with a couple of healing potions that he'd coaxed out of Kawani herself, but he found to his dismay that Daryl hadn't been doing things by halves while impersonating a shadow tornado. Jake and Kawani's respective potions had all been destroyed beyond recognition. The healer had no doubt done his homework first and knew that the witch had an anti-monster potion in her grasp that could be detrimental to them. Now all the young woman could do was heal on her own. The rest of the night passed without a hitch, and at dawn the morning report from the robotic voice repeated the past night's events. As expected, the rest of the village had remained peaceful, the other survivors quietly staying in their own homes. Without Daryl and the 5 monsters, only 14 villagers were left to compete. Carmen finally revealed how she knew he wasn't a monster, and it turned out that her first role was not farmer, but henchman. Henchman was a unique role, whose only privilege was to know the identity of the original monsters right from the start of the round. To get rich, she could only use this information wisely. Depending on how you look at it, this was a role that could be considered as a cheat or as totally useless. In all objectivity, Carmen had made poor use of this ability. Her disinterest in the monster game and her focus on filling her stomach had prevented her from doing anything meaningful. Because of this, Carmen was currently one of the poorest villagers. Killing Susan had barely replenished her fluid card. As for Jake, after transferring all the fluid from his victims into his own fluid card, he reached the modest fortune of 257,635,892 units. Whether he converted this amount into ether or used it to feed his fluid core, he was now unquestionably the Rick.H.E.S.T man in the village. The next morning, Gordon and Carl heard about last night's events from the other villagers and promptly called for Kawani's death when they learned she was still unconscious. The wicked officer had spent a horrible night anguishing outside as a vagabond after the destruction of his home, and he was so terrified that he had not been able to catch a wink of sleep all night. Upon learning that there was still a monster left, his paranoia had flared up again. FUCK off. Jake shoved him off without a qualm when he caught sight of his bald head and obsequious smile. As long as Kawani was in his house, the wimpy officer would have no chance to exact his revenge. Jake then met up with Peter Brady to thank him for the previous day's tip. The player was still as high on drugs as ever, and he had to sacrifice some of the narcoleptic herbs he had been harvesting in the forest to get his attention. The truth from Peter's mouth proved to be quite anticlimactic, but also left them speechless. The junkie's role was village idiot. If Jake had previously thought that henchman was the most unique role, he was mistaken. The village idiot was even wackier. The village idiot knew everyone's roles without exception. Being a simpleton, he also received a small amount of fluid every day as charity. In other words, without doing anything, it was possible to amass enough fluid to qualify for the next round. But there was a catch. If the village idiot was asked about his role or what he knew about other people's roles, he was not allowed to lie. It was so ridiculous that no one would have thought of it. With his initial infraction, Peter had bluffed everyone by selling what he knew about the pit at a hefty price. If any of them had been savvy enough or even accidentally asked what his role was or what he knew about the others, his cover would have been blown from day one. Indirectly, the third person in the know was the Inquisitor, because Carl used to tell him everything, but the Inquisitor didn't care about the game. As soon as he got his points, he qualified for the next round and left. Chapter 437, End of the First Round, Part 2. Carmen, can you confirm that he's not a monster either? Jake was already pretty much convinced, but an extra precaution didn't cost anything. The vampire studied Peter with her dead fish eye for a fleeting instant, then concurred. It's not one of the original monsters anyway. We can have Carl interrogate it with his confessor role to be on the safe side. And that's what we'll do. Jake approved of the idea. They spent the rest of the morning questioning the rest of the villagers, comparing their stories in order to catch any enemy who might have slipped through the cracks. With the confessor, the henchman, and the village idiot helping out, the probability was slim to none. Carl confirmed Peter and Carmen's story, while Gordon submitted to the standard search that Jake subjected him to. With the invincible demon impression the officer had painted of him, getting him to cooperate could not have been more straightforward. The cards in the bailiff's possession completed his knowledge of the game, and seeing his interest in them, all the participants under his protection agreed to show him theirs. Some of them had already been played, but Jake noticed that, unlike him, the normal participants harbored little hope of winning. As a result, their choice was mostly treasure, enchantment, or event cards, and these were all cards that could save their lives in a crucial situation. Some of these cards were useful items that could be used as prerequisites for certain roles or other cards, while the others had all sorts of fancy abilities. The non-exhaustive list of cards with unpredictable effects included treasure cards, weapons, armor, accessories, potions, recipes, role items, treasures, fluid card, etc. Enchantment cards, teleportation, shield, imposter, unbreakable lock, metamorphosis, tracking, offensive/defensive spells, unassailable, copy. Event cards, climate, earthquake, flood, meteorite, beginner's luck, jackpot, pardon, diplomatic immunity, prison break, reconversion, falling in love, invasion, double/triple pick, lottery, etc. Most of these cards had self-explanatory titles, while others had not yet proven their worth. Prison break, for example, was still irrelevant, since there were no prisons to speak of in their village. Jake suspected it might be feasible to lock up criminals convicted by a vote, but this had yet to be proven. Jake did not confiscate these cards. These natives were already under his protection and would continue to provide him with a significant stream of fluid over the subsequent rounds. He had to preserve their trust, and a tyrannical attitude was not the way to do so. After that, all that remained was for him to visit the last two players. Their planet was closer to their own sun than the Earth, and its rotation on itself was slower. So slow that a year was only 2 days long. The sun could shine on the same side of the planet for several months before darkness fell, and because of this the temperatures could easily reach unbearable levels. In order to survive, his people all without exception had a very dark skin capable of withstanding a lot of radiation. Indeed, because of the slow rotation of their planet, the solar winds were not properly neutralized, and the radiation was much more deadly than on Earth. Drastin was what his people called a troll hunter. From the Emer tribe, every year a few children would awaken a talent that the natives called the troll curse. After years, decades, centuries of fighting, the curse would eventually make them the very same trolls they had sworn to fight. Nevertheless, in the meantime, they enjoyed all the legendary attributes associated with this belligerent and stupid creature, notably their incredible longevity and exceptional endurance. To make the most of their existence, the awakened were then taken away from their parents to be trained, and their lives were often miserable, albeit necessary for the tribe's survival. Before getting his oracle device, Drastin thought he was cursed by the Versing warlocks, but he had eventually learnt in the mirror universe that it was purely a matter of genetic and etheric code. His people were not aware of it, or perhaps one of their ancestors had suppressed the truth, but these trolls they hated were simply their ancestors. With the oracle's rewards, stopping the inevitable mutation had been a breeze, and he could now look forward to enjoying a normal life. Alas, fighting these trolls was the only thing he had ever known, and getting back to living a normal life was not that easy. With the omnipresent digester threat, the digesters had replaced the trolls. In the end, the only player suspect left was Ostrexeridamon. Without Kawani's warning, he would never have been interested in her, but with the round coming to an end he wanted to tie up any loose ends. The only hitch was that the Indian had not yet woken up, so he had to rely on himself. Finding her residence turned out to be no big deal. This female player's house was, like Jake's, on the edge of the village, but in the opposite direction. Such locations had advantages and drawbacks. On the one hand, they were quieter, but on the other hand, it was difficult to gain the trust of other villagers, since it was hard to keep an eye on them. As soon as he saw Ostrexera's house, a cold and sinister wind began to blow down the alley for no explainable reason, and the first thing he noticed was the wilted flowers at the entrance. The closer one got to the old stone building, the more sparse the vegetation became. Are you sure you want to go? Svara struggled to hide her nervousness without much success. She may have been a Valkyrie now, but supernatural phenomena still scared her. The Nawaya were roughly prehistoric men, and it would take time for them to give up their old superstitions. You can wait for us here if you don't feel like it. Jake allowed her. Then he glanced at Carmen, but saw only her icy composure and unwavering resolve. Are you a reptile or something? Of course, his words would never reach his lips. He had a reckless streak, not a suicidal one. Besides, he knew it was a front. The vampire probably had the most self-control issues of all the remaining participants. At long last, he knocked on the door. Their rune-covered residences had already proven their sturdiness, so he was taken aback when it cracked on first impact. He had trouble controlling his force, but not to the point of damaging a reinforced wooden door. "Come in." A placid voice invited him inside. He was about to open the door when he heard footsteps behind him. Turning his head, he recognized Laxmini, the female soldier hanging out with Ostrexera. She was carrying a wicker basket and seemed surprised to meet him there. However, she did not engage in dialogue. Despite her curiosity, she snuck past him and went through the door to deliver whatever was in her basket. Cold and stark, but not in the sense of temperature. In all honesty, the room temperature was mild, with a fireplace already burning in the middle of the day. There was even another wood-burning heater to keep the room warm. However, even with these arrangements, the place was as devoid of human life and warmth as a Fucking asteroid. Cobwebs hung from the wall and ceiling, while a thick layer of dust covered the floor and furniture. Skeletons of dead rats were everywhere, and a musty smell saturated the place. Without the fireplace, one would have thought that the house had been uninhabited for a long time. It was all the more disturbing because at the beginning of the round, his own house was perfectly clean. If this house was no exception, accumulating such a level of grime in such a short time was no small feat. Scanning the room with his eyes, Jake found neither Laxmini nor Ostrexera. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. Realizing something, he activated his Murtharian sight as he focused the perception ether in his eyes, and the scenery immediately changed. A neat, well-maintained interior unveiled itself before his eyes. The two women were also standing in front of him and calmly staring at him. Ostrexera was as apathetic and austere as usual. Her pallor was sickly, like a corpse, while her unkempt hair and gothic black makeup only added to the grimness. She was still barefoot, but he noticed that they were immaculately clean. Come to think of it, he hadn't found any footprints on the path that matched her shoe size. "You are as versatile and insightful as I feared." Ostrexera greeted him in a monotone. "To what do I owe the honor of the great Jake Wilderth's visit?" Jake raised an eyebrow, half believing he caught a hint of sarcasm, but he brushed off the jab. "You know very well why I'm here." He didn't beat around the bush. "I know for a fact that you're one of the monsters from the get-go. I should have thought of that the moment Kawani called for us to vote against you. You're the one who turned her, right?" Chapter 438, End of the First Round, Part 3. If you know, why bother asking? Because your answer might change my decision. Jake pretended to unsheath his machete for extra effect. "Show me your fluid card. If you refuse, you'll be picked as a villain in the noon vote, and I can promise you that not only will I get what I want, but I won't be as polite and accommodating as I am now. Of course, you can always qualify if you have enough fluid." In response, a ghastly killing intent shrouded the room, and the temperature sharply dropped several degrees. This was the first time Jake had found himself on the receiving end of an intimidation attempt through mental pressure. "You really think you're something, don't you?" Ostrexera scolded menacingly in a throaty voice. Her hair bristled as if gravity had reversed, and her feet lifted above the ground. A greenish halo enveloped her body, and you could almost see the wall behind through her dress. Jake's face turned solemn, but that was usually foreboding for the others. His own killing intent began to bubble up from his own body, and the cold room bathed in ghostly green glow was brutally contrasted by a searing heat. The spirit power exerted by Ostrexera was immediately squeezed by an even more oppressive force, and soon a scorching heat reigned in the small house. The ghostly halo enveloping her was now limited to only 10 centimeters from her body, the rest of the room being swamped by Jake's released mental power. "I am dominating you." Jake yawned matter-of-factly. Ostrexera remained nonplussed by her predicament, which sparked Jake and Carmen's suspicions. He couldn't attack her before the vote, but that didn't mean she would have a better chance afterwards. Unless, of course, she was hiding a secret weapon for later. "You're overthinking this." The female player snorted as she guessed what was bothering him. "I don't need that to defeat you." The greenish halo surrounding her suddenly shone forth, and Jake's fiery aura was blown away like a small summer breeze meeting a tornado. The room turned cold again in an instant, and their eyelids became momentarily heavy, their senses constricted by a primal feeling of fear that was anything but natural. Shrill wails assaulted their eardrums. but the screams seemed to echo directly inside their heads. Jake considered activating his berserk mode to salvage his ego, but then changed his mind. Even if he activated bloodline ignition, he wasn't sure he could win a spiritual duel. This exchange had finally given him an understanding of what kind of opponent Ostrexera was. Ostrexera was a monster from the start, not because she had drawn the monster card, but because she had always been one. If he wasn't mistaken, she wasn't human and was in fact some kind of evil ghost. In this form, Jake rated her spirit body between level 20 and 25. Each additional level of spirit body was not a simple matter of addition. Tangible, measurable effects would arise as it evolved, and if he wasn't mistaken, Ostrexera's spirit body could wreak immense havoc with its very existence. The poltergeist effects that some hoaxers sometimes mention to scare people were no joke in her case, and there was a remote possibility that her mental stats were also superior to his. He still couldn't say clearly if the mental ether stats alone were enough to advance the soul, but they couldn't be too low. I'll come back after the vote. I'll let you make your decision in the meantime. Jake stepped down first. As soon as he withdrew his apex predator glyph, the inhuman screams racking him to the bone stopped as well. Carmen took one last cold look at Ostrexera and Laxmini, then followed Jake without a word. Once far enough from the house, and after reuniting with Svara, she asked, "Why did you let her win? I know you could resist if you wanted to." "Because it wasn't necessary," Jake explained lamely. "Ostrexera is even more stubborn than I am. I wanted answers and I got them. She is indeed a monster, but she has some glaring flaws. If I'm not mistaken, she will choose to qualify before the voting is over." "Her flaws? Did you notice?" Carmen paused. "Yeah, I was wondering how our roles were determined, and I think I have some semblance of an answer. It doesn't matter if we're a monster in the morphological sense, in which case, you and I would have been chosen for the monster role. What really matters is our darker side. Take Susan, for example. Pretty, sweet on the surface, but upon inquiring, I learned that after all her years in the military, she never got promoted after reaching her rank of private first class. Apparently, she is known for her rudeness and repeated insubordination. Sexual harassment from her colleagues and superiors must have been a factor, but over time she built up a lot of resentment. She probably dreamed of killing them all more than once. With the corruption's influence and the power granted by this monster role, she grew wings and let her overflowing spite run rampant. "I don't believe in that theory," she argued cautiously. "I think everyone's heart harbors a certain darkness. No one is really a saint. Susan Byrne may have had all the makings of a good monster, but I'm sure Gordon or Carl would have done just as well." She was right. With Gordon's underhanded and vengeful nature, combined with his inferiority complex and cowardice, it was quite likely that he would have made an excellent monster if given such power. Well, then other criteria come into play, but I'm convinced that our true nature remains the main criterion. Jake stated with equanimity, "Someone who can create a game like this is not someone we can understand on our level. I wouldn't be surprised if we were just pawns on a chessboard. We think we're in control, but we're just following the plan laid out for us." Jake took a breath to steady himself and closed with one final prediction. Ultimately, this monster game is just a human experiment where the creator of this place tests his purgatory. Believe it or not, sooner or later, we will all be judged for our actions. If you want to survive, don't try to win this game. Instead, find a way to opt out of it. On the way back, the trio fell into silence, pondering over his last words. When they arrived home, they found that Kawani had regained consciousness. Once on her feet, the rest was simple. They walked her home, and with the herbs Jake had scavenged, she made a batch of healing potions. As soon as the pot was ready, she downed one of the vials, and all her wounds instantly disappeared, except for her fatigue. The blood and nutrients she had lost would take some time to recover, but with their player vitality, there was nothing to worry about. "Now, Kawani, it's your turn to tell us the truth." Jake obliged her to spill the beans as soon as he thought she was healthy enough. To survive, she had also been forced to accept being turned into a monster. To this day, she still got goosebumps thinking about it. Becoming a monster was not as simple as taking on a new role card. The victim was infected for real. The monster had to assume its monstrous form, and in this state bite or claw its victim deeply. The teeth and claws carried a powerful poison that rendered the transformation exceedingly painful, and she had feared she would lose her mind back then. Ever since, she could feel a link connecting her mentally to Ostrexera. It was vague and didn't really influence her decisions, but it was very much there. Just as Jake thought he had it figured out, she clutched his wrist tightly, and from her shaking, he knew how terrified and overwhelmed she was. Jake, Ostrexera isn't like the other monsters. She doesn't kill brainlessly. During this round, she's only been preparing her forces. She only recruits women. You weren't around for the last few days, but in addition to the Inquisitor, there are 2 other women who have managed to qualify without attracting attention. Helene Ingas the teacher and another miner named Strand. Impossible. They never came back from the pit. Svara shook her head. But do you even know why they were sent there? The Valkyrie flashed a puzzled look for a few seconds before exclaiming, "No way." Yeah, they attacked Ostrexera in broad daylight and paid the price for it. Kawani revealed grimly. Jake, who had missed all the interesting gossip during his 5 days in the pit, wasn't particularly moved by all the twists. All he wanted was something concrete. And so, how did they qualify if they didn't come back? And how do you know about it? Chapter 439, End of the First Round, Part 4. It was Laxmini who told me. Kawani defended herself wholeheartedly. She is also one of the monsters, except that she did it of her own free will. To pull this off, Ostrexera sneakily met them in the pit and gave them enough fluid to qualify from there. Since they were still in the pit, no message announced their qualification. As far as the other villagers were concerned, they died in the pit. Jake didn't even question whether Ostrexera could really enter the pit of her own free will without alarming anyone. He knew it was feasible because he had taken some steps in that direction himself. Once all the questions were answered, Jake paced around the witch's shack for a few minutes before rendering his judgment. Okay, Kawani, I'm giving you a chance. You escaped the slave contract, but you'll have to sign a temporary servant contract until the ordeal is over. I'll let you think about the clauses you want to include in it. Carmen, you are exempt from it for the time being, but I have my eye on you too. Don't give me a reason to change my mind. HMMPF. The gorgeous vampire harumphed as she turned her head with the firm intention of snubbing him. Now let's go vote. We've got work to do, Jake said as he left the cabin. The vote went as planned and Ostrexera and Laxmini were declared guilty, while Jake was once again given the status of enforcer. Not surprisingly, the robotic voice announced the qualification of the 2 fugitives a few minutes later. With the 2 monsters out, all that remained was Kawani's case to win the round. Good news for them. The Native American woman didn't have enough fluid to qualify. Over the next few days, Jake and the remaining survivors continued to accumulate the fluid and cards they were missing without fear of being slaughtered in their sleep. The easiest way to accumulate fluid without stealing it from others was to get it by drawing. There were 3 cards that made it easy to accumulate fluid from the worst to the best. The simplest was the treasure card, fluid card, which was exactly what the title implied, a fluid card containing a certain amount of fluid. The amount was random, ranging from 100,000 to 20 M. The second and third methods depended on 2 event cards, lottery and jackpot. Jackpot multiplied the amount of fluid a villager owned by 3, while lottery could give away huge amounts of fluid, but also various items and other cards. The king of them all was the jackpot card. By using several in a row, it was possible to increase your fortune exponentially. Unfortunately, the card was ridiculously rare. With the exception of a player who had shown him one a few days earlier, none of the villagers managed to draw it in the days that followed. There was even a significant likelihood that this card was unique or could only be drawn a certain number of times. It made perfect sense. As powerful as the creator of this monster game was, it was impossible for him to generate an infinite stream of purified fluid. The reverse would have been far more shocking. During this time, Jake also got 2 new roles. Villager, Monster Hunter, Rare, upgradable, can attack identified monsters at any time. Prerequisite, kill a monster. Villager, Hero, Legendary, can vote against 1 person each round. If the hero betrays the hero's values, they lose their role. Prerequisite, gain recognition from the village and end the night attacks in 1 round. He had fulfilled the requirements of the first role long ago, and a native under his protection had willingly offered him this card that was rotting in his hands. This card resembled the barber's card, but was far superior to it in that it was permanent and did not limit the number of attacks. The existence of this card added an additional constraint for the monsters by emphasizing the importance of keeping their monster identity secret. Because of its importance, Jake had collected several of these cards to redistribute to his allies. Drastin, Svara, and Carmen had also been given this role. As for the second role, he had more than earned it, and it was Kawani who had given him this card. Obtaining the villagers' recognition and the hero's values were very vague terms, but they probably included concrete criteria, such as saving a certain number of people, eliminating monsters, etc. Overall, these two new roles consolidated his status and gave him even more leverage than he already had. He was now ready for the next round. Thanks to Kawani, he was also able to learn more about how the monster card works. Monster, upgradable, can roam the village during the first half of the night, can enter a house each night and attack its residents. While in monster form, usable only at night, the participant will be granted superhuman abilities. The monster form gets stronger after each cycle and each kill performed under this form. After 3 cycles, the monster obtains the contamination ability, allowing it to convert villagers into monsters via bites or scratches. Limited to once per cycle. Kawani's monster card was limited in information, but she assured him that Avro's or Ostrexera's monster card would definitely be very different from hers. Avro's especially had killed a lot of people. With his reputation and fluid ACCU.mulat over the days, Jake was also able to upgrade his Forest Warden and Lord roles to the next rank. He was currently gaining 7 reputation points each cycle from the villagers under his protection, which included 5 natives, Kawani, and Svara. Gordon and Carl had also ended up joining them for fear of being ostracized, which brought the total to 9 points per day. It was possible to upgrade most of the roles without relying on reputation points or fluid, but having enough of them would bypass most of the prerequisites. For Forest Warden in particular, he would have had to spend most of his time in the forest to meet the requirements. After upgrading, his 2 roles were now as follows. Villager, Lord, Baron. Upgradable, the Lord can offer to protect other participants against a certain fee. The Lord can protect up to 100 people. Can mobilize the village guards. Prerequisites: letters of nobility, saving a person from a monster attack, or possessing the monster hunter role. Forest Warden, LVL2, had increased the limit of permissions and bans from 1 to 3, but it was the Lord role that had evolved drastically. As of now, he could no longer lose his role by failing to save one of his protégés, and the number of people under his protection had increased from 1 more person per cycle to a set number of 100. He didn't yet know what mobilizing the guards meant, but he would find out soon enough. At first, Jake and the others planned to abuse the system by taking advantage of the timeout to gather fluid and cards, but less than a week later they had to forego this method. The corruption was gaining ground. With no enemies or threats looming, the remaining villagers had regained much of their nerve, but it was short-lived. The respect and fear that Jake instilled in them was enough to curb them for a few days, but not much longer. On the 4th day, the incidents resumed, and one of the only remaining female villagers was almost RAP'd. The next day, Carl and Gordon tried to kill each other and were thrown into the pit. They survived, but by the time they returned they had mellowed noticeably. When Peter told him one morning that the herbs were no longer enough to satisfy his addiction, and that Drastin was spending far too much time slaying monsters in the forest, Jake knew it was time to end the round. On the one hand, Jake didn't want to see his protégés die because of the benefits he was getting from them for his Lord role. And on the other hand, because even he could feel his mood turning chaotic again despite his recent progress. If this continued, he would have to go back into the pit, but there was no guarantee that more lava would be waiting for him down there. On the morning of the 8th day, Jake and the other villagers gathered, and he informed them of his decision. Some of the natives, especially Gordon, protested and made a fuss, but unfortunately for them, he wasn't asking their opinion. As long as Kawani agreed to qualify, the round would end. And she did agree, of course, because of the servant contract she had signed. Not sure if they would all end up on the other side. They said their goodbyes to the young Indian girl, and she disappeared before their eyes, followed by the robotic voice announcing the end of the round and the villagers' victory. Chapter 440 Platinum Reward Card. After this message, Jake's vision shifted and the village disappeared as well, replaced by a dark room filled with runes. These runes slowly revolved around various piles of cards, and he soon realized that the only usable items in this place were his own fluid card and the other cards and game items in his possession. His machete, backpack, and supplies were nowhere in sight. There were 5 piles of cards, and each one was made out of a different material. From left to right, it was bronze, silver, gold, platinum, and diamond. Exactly the same system used for titles and glyphs during his second ordeal. When nothing happened, Jake checked his fluid card and found that the reward section that was usually grayed out was now highlighted. With nothing better to do, he clicked on it. At once, the familiar robotic voice buzzed in his head. Participant Jake Wilderth. Point calculation. 4 active roles, 1 unique legendary role, 2 LVL2 roles, 1 LVL1 role. ACC.U.Mulat fluid. 312,469,215 units. Reputation points, 69. Number of monsters eliminated, 4. Other achievements. Calculation complete. Determining the reward. Platinum reward. At that moment, the second stack of cards from the right floated toward him, and the radiance enveloping it disappeared, allowing him to draw a card. Without Jake having to draw anything, the card at the top of the pile flew to him and merged with his fluid card. As soon as the platinum card touched his fluid card, he knew exactly what the reward consisted of. Platinum reward card. Using it converts a role of your choice into a permanent title, otherwise known as a soul glyph. Jake's eyes almost popped out as he read the description. Boy, that was quite a payoff. The news was so surreal and unexpected that he found it hard to accept. He thought that this ordeal would be shitty till the end, but it seemed that it wouldn't be. At least now, even if he failed his main mission, the glyph alone would guarantee that he hadn't wasted all his efforts. Of course, he had no intention of using this card now. Unfortunately, now that he knew the rewards were worth it, his original plan to escape the purgatory had taken a serious hit. Jake forced himself to breathe in deeply to get rid of those pesky thoughts, but even after several minutes it dawned on him that it was hopeless. The carrot was too good to ignore. Sorry, she. I'll continue to be selfish a little longer. If I run away without giving it my best shot, I might blame myself for the rest of my life. His Oracle AI sighed softly, but she didn't try to stop him. As soon as she had learned about the contents of the Platinum reward card, she had known that nothing would change his mind. Just promise me one thing. She coerced him to pledge. Don't let the lure of money keep you from seeing what truly matters. If your life is in danger, then run. Jake vowed not to do anything foolish, but she heaved a weary sigh upon hearing his empty words. She had made her point, and that was all that mattered. Once he got his reward, the stack of platinum cards reunited with the other stacks, and a few seconds later the scenery changed again and the stacks disappeared. When his vision stabilized again, he was back in a village. You are joining the playing field of the second round. Do you wish to change your initial role of Forest Warden? If so, you will lose your current initial role and be allowed to draw a new role card. Jake declined outright. Once his answer was confirmed, he was finally allowed to focus on his new surroundings. Jake looked around vigilantly, but he had to concede that the cobblestone road and the stone houses looked exactly like the village he had just left. If the names on the house signs weren't different, he might have thought he had returned to the village of the first round. My lord. Jake froze in place as he saw a group of riders in chainmail gallop in, then jump off their horses unannounced to kneel before him. He was so taken aback that he tried to draw his machete in a hurry before remembering that he no longer had his belongings on him. My lord, the middle-aged man kneeling at the front of the squad repeated patiently as he continued to stare at the pavement. The soldier's prodding put an end to his ramblings. He didn't need to make things clear for now. Just accept the situation as it was. Was this soldier treating him as his lord? So be it. What is the situation? He asked with his newfound coolness. To be honest, the situation is not good, my lord. The officer gave a wry smile. Without you to lead us, the monsters are rampant, and our relationship with the other villages is rather tense at the moment. At this rate, there won't be any villagers left soon. Jake looked again at the houses nearby, more attentively this time, and found that indeed most of the signs had no names on them. About 1 out of every 2 houses was unoccupied. How many villagers does the village currently have? Jake got right to the point. 27, my lord. No. 28, 29, 36, 41? What the hell is going on? Jake got to watch an NPC bugging out live before his eyes. If he wasn't sure if these guys were players or natives when they first showed up, at least now there was no doubt. After a few moments of bugging, the guard's response stabilized. 26 guards, 6 domestics, and 46 villagers, my lord. Good. Take me to my residence. Jake ordered calmly. No need to kneel in my presence in the future. Yes, my lord. Follow me. A saddled black stallion was brought to him by a smiling guard, and to put on a proper show, Jake had to hop on and act like an experienced rider. A hint, he wasn't. As soon as he took the reins in hand, the horse reared up and tried to buck him off with all its might. With his strength, Jake had no trouble restraining it, but to get it to move forward, he had to heel it so hard that he broke a few of the poor stallion's ribs. After this thrashing, his unruly mount proved to be much more docile. Jake had learned to ride as a child, and although he was not an expert, he had the basics. With his horse's temper, he couldn't help but suspect that the guards were setting him up. Though from their approving expressions, there was probably nothing wrong with it. With his intelligence and agility, it only took a few minutes for Jake to go from clumsy to a flawless rider. He expected the guards to lead him back to the forest where his old home was located, but he was caught off guard when they headed for the fortress in the center of the village. When they stopped in front of the drawbridge of a modest moated castle, but still 50 times larger than his old home, Jake found himself unable to suppress his disbelief. I live here. The gate guards freaked out, as they thought he was discontent with the place. What's wrong, my lord? One of them stuttered as he bowed. We can fix that, if you tell us what you want. Jake studied their expressions for a moment before shaking his head. It's okay. Just leave me alone for now. I'll have you summoned if I need you. Once the drawbridge was lowered, he entered a small, well-kept courtyard that included a small stable as well as a training ground and a small barracks for the castle guards. As soon as she saw him, a maid scurried over to offer her services, but he declined. Instead, he immediately dismissed all the staff. When the drawbridge was pulled up behind him, Jake finally heaved a big sigh of relief. Finally, peace and quiet, he muttered in a low voice. For the next 15 minutes, he set about visiting every room in his new home. The entrance gate was a double door, with wings so high that they were twice his size. All in all, everything had been thought of in a big way. The bedroom alone was larger than his former home of Forest Warden, while the dining room was large enough to host banquets for several hundred people. If he wished, he could invite the entire village to eat. The furniture was also exquisite, provided you liked the medieval style of the time, while the walls and floor were covered with rugs and tapestry. There were even a few works of art in the form of paintings and sculptures that would not have been out of place in a museum. Most of the tapestries and Dr. A.P. Erie's were elaborately woven around the edges, but the inside was almost always monochromatic, as if they were waiting for someone to add a coat of arms. In addition to all this ostentatious opulence, as with any self-respecting lord, a comfortable throne sat at the end of the main hall, where he was supposed to receive complaints from the villagers and other reports from his subjects. Jake also found the dungeons as well as an armory where he found his previous equipment as he continued his exploration, which answered one of the unanswered questions he had been wondering about for a while. That is, what the prison break card was for. As he climbed the stairs to the top floor, he was able to access the balcony of the highest tower, and an unobstructed view of the surrounding landscape unfolded before his eyes. Chapter 441 New Rules, Part 1. At first glance, Jake understood that this round would be nothing like the previous one. Yes, aside from a few minor alterations, the village had not changed much, albeit much larger and with most of the residences unoccupied. The layout of the buildings was more or less the same, with the addition of the castle. The mountain and its mine was still there, as well as the lake and the forest. Even the hill and its manor had not budged, although the hill was now higher and more than one villa sat atop it. What had actually changed was that the village no longer ended at its former border. Whether it was the lake or the forest of the past round, these extended much further, demarcating many similar villages that stretched to the horizon. From his position, Jake warped the air with his telekinesis to form a huge lens that would double as a telescope, and decided to take a thorough look at the surroundings. After a few minutes of meticulous observation, he determined that the neighboring villages were in a similar situation to his own. In the absence of participants, their NPCs seemed to be operating autonomously according to their pre-established alliances. Jake spotted a cohort of guard warring against another, but also a party of hunters entering the forest carrying longbows. He even spotted a thief quietly picking at the front door of an empty house to do some larceny. Turning his attention to his own village, Jake finally sighted some real players. Like him, they were unsettled by the change and trying to adjust to their new surroundings. He was immediately relieved when he recognized his comrades from the previous round. The overall location of their residences had not changed too much, so he found Kawani and Carmen without much difficulty. Drastin was in front of his barber shop, while Gordon was busy kicking chickens as he cursed the whole universe. Carl was spacing out in front of the majestic cathedral, replacing his old chapel, while Svara was familiarizing herself with the new tools in her tannery. As Jake continued to search for the villagers from the last round, he eventually found all of them, except for those who had qualified several days prior. Or so he thought. Surveying the manor at the top of the hill, he gawked as he recognized the ghostly figure of Ostrexera and her faithful sidekick Laxmini. They stayed, Jake murmured, stroking his chin thoughtfully. Perhaps out of instinct, or because her perception was so high, Ostrexera kept her head in his direction, and their eyes met for a brief moment. She held the eye contact without displaying any restlessness, and did not try to flee. Nevertheless, she whispered something to Laxmini, who then ran to hide inside the mansion. Jake instantly realized that they had to solve this problem right away for the round to go smoothly. He was the Baron of this village now, and if he wanted to, he could make life difficult for the other villagers by dispatching the guards. When Jake was about to visit her for a heated discussion, his bracelet, which hadn't done much good recently, suddenly notified him that he was receiving a call. He was delighted when he saw the caller's name. "Hey Will, how are you?" Jake took the call in a good mood. He wasn't the type to be nostalgic, but reuniting with his faction was definitely a good reason to rejoice. "Jake, you're finally here." Will's very animated voice rang out from the other end of the device. "Tell me where you are, and we'll come visit you. Tim and the two sisters are with me." Not that I don't want to, but how do I do that?" Jake quashed his enthusiasm unabashedly. "Oh, good question. Wait a minute. Can you see the other villages from where you are?" Jake heard him fiddling with something on his end, but waited for him to finish before he bragged smugly. "Yep, I'm on top of my castle. I'm admiring the view." Radio silence. Then he heard overexcited shouts from the other side, including Tim's. "Sorry about the noise. We'll reply a little later. You have no idea how good this news is. We've been considering this scenario but thought it unlikely. The Lord on our side is one hell of a bastard." Jake grew bitter as he sensed how little faith they had in him. "That's not what we mean." Will justified himself right away as he felt him brooding. "Just that we know how much you hate making things difficult for yourself. Lord forces you to socialize, and usually that's more my job." "No biggie. If you're up in a castle, we should be able to find each other easily." Will continued. "Tell me, if you see our signal." With his telekinetic telescope, Jake searched the sky carefully, but it wasn't necessary. A firework exploded a few villages away with incredible brightness. He then pointed his telescope below and found Will and his group standing at the edge of the woods. Will wore a traveler's wool cloak, while the two sisters were bundled up in thick mantles, their pink hair hidden under a large hood. Only Tim was really recognizable. He looked crestfallen, but that was understandable after Lily's elimination. In addition to them, Aaron and two other men accompanied them. "I see you." "Perfect. Can you pick us up? The roads aren't very safe right now." Jake was somewhat taken aback by his lack of bravery, but he didn't mind. "Sure. Give me a few minutes." Like a bird of prey, Jake darted over the tower balcony and with a thump catapulted himself forward like a goddamn cannonball. The guards and villagers below were buffeted by a blast of wind, but by the time they looked up the culprit was long gone. Leaping from house to house, then tree to tree, Jake quickly crossed the distance to his friends. He could have flown, but he preferred not to hasten the corruption's propagation if he didn't have to. A few minutes later, he landed in front of them noiselessly and Will nearly had a heart attack when Jake patted him on the shoulder. "Jesus, don't ever do that again." I thought Scour and his minions had caught up with us. Why do you look so stressed? Jake asked dubiously. It's not like they can attack you in the middle of the day. Unless you. We'll talk about that later. The businessman pushed him toward the road, glancing behind him skittishly from time to time. Too late. One of the other two men grimaced as he saw a group of guards in mismatched chainmail appear down the road behind them. At their helm, a huge, fat, muscular, pierced fellow licked his lips as he stared at Will with a gleeful expression. Will. The fat man swaggered as he banged the butt of his club against his other hand. The nerd shook like a leaf with each utterance of his name. For a second there, I thought you were leaving me all alone. Scour lamented with a theatrical flourish. You know how much? I'm counting on you, right? Will may have been nervous, but with Jake as backup, he found the courage to retort. Fuck off, Scour. You're even worse than the bugs on this station. We're getting out of here whether you like it or not. In response to the resolute tirade of the snotty youth in front of him, the fat man's oily forehead creased dangerously. The scruffy guards next to him immediately drew their weapons as they sensed the change in atmosphere. Jake would have gladly sat back and enjoyed the scene while eating popcorn on the side, but unfortunately, as a faction leader, he couldn't stand by and let his subordinates be humiliated in front of him. Calmly, he stepped in between the two. It was not until he moved that Scour took notice of the intruder. Who are you? The fat man asked cautiously. Unlike the tough guy image he gave off, he wasn't that brave. He was able to sense when the wind was turning, or he wouldn't have survived all this time. And right now, his gut was telling him it wasn't a wind, but a hurricane that was blowing. Jake Wilderth. Jake replied placidly, leader of the Murtharian nerds. The person you were threatening is one of my subordinates. Scour didn't know what a nerd was, but to him the term was obscure and cryptic enough to make him think twice. Abandoning his old ways, a cheesy smile that Gordon would not have disavowed flashed across his face, accentuating his triple chin even more than it already was. It was a misunderstanding. Scour backed off first. It pains me that Will wants to leave us, but I think too highly of him to force him to stay. The fat man then raised a fist in the air, and the guards sheathed their weapons before backing away. Before leaving, Scour gave a last threatening glare to Will, who flinched again. The fat man wanted to do more, but when he saw Jake frowning in annoyance, he chickened out. After that, he rejoined his bodyguards and walked away without looking back. Who is this Scour? Jake questioned with interest. He seemed to know you well. Long story. Will grumbled as they set off. Chapter 442 New Rules, Part 2. On the way home, the businessman explained that he and Scour had met in the previous round. The overweight SCU.M wasn't a monster, but he was no angel either. In order to survive, Will had been forced to team up with this bastard. That was fine in round 1, because despite his flaws, Scour was somewhat protective. Without his comrades, from whom he had been separated, the gangster was not so C.O.C.KY, willingly choosing diplomacy over violence. Because he was strong enough and Will did the talking, they had earned the trust of the other villagers as they saved them on multiple occasions. Of course, their round was not nearly as dangerous as Jake's. The 3 original monsters were natives that their players had no trouble defeating. There were no inquisitors or outstanding players. As soon as the remaining monster got his points, he left, and their round was over. In the end, his village was one of the first to enter the second round. Like Jake, they had discovered the differences between the 2 rounds at their own expense. For some, the more flexible and realistic setting was a welcome improvement, but for those like Will who depended on the rules to survive, it had been a disaster. The main difference between the first and second rounds, Will explained, was that it was much easier to attack. For starters, the Lord had full power in his village. He could mobilize the guards and attack anyone in his territory for no reason. What counterbalanced this almost absolute authority of the Lord in his territory was the new voting system. Unlike before, where the effect of a vote lasted only a single day, the sentence was now instant and irrevocable. First, the villager voted guilty would be sent immediately to the pit. If he returned alive, he would be deemed a criminal. As long as the Lord did not revoke this status, it was permanent. In the Lord's absence, the mayor, then the captain in order, held this authority, including the ability to mobilize the guards. These guards were not to be underestimated. They were not numerous, but their power rivaled that of the top-tier players. This was to prevent anarchy from flourishing too easily and to assert the authority of the current lord. The other crucial aspect that had changed was that neighboring villages were not under the same jurisdiction. One village's criminal could have the status of villager in another, and all that was required was to obtain citizenship. It was the role of the mayor and the bailiff to handle these new migrants. If the villagers of one village were not free to act as they wished, it was different when it concerned another village. Thus, a villager from village A could attack a villager from village B without fear of retaliation. The lords were also able to form alliances with each other, which extended the ban on attacks to their common territories. However, very few had used this feature until now. When Scour discovered the new advantages of his lord status, he suddenly changed his attitude, revealing his true nature. The tax he had put in place was simply obnoxious, while the guards took charge of controlling every entrance and exit of the village. The guard was a special entity. It was equal to 30% of the lord's protective capacity, or 30 guards in Jake's case, and these guards could respawn from the barracks every other day. Once born, they behaved like any other villager, and their guard role could even be upgraded, as with the officer who answered his questions when he arrived. As with the guards, if the village's population did not reach the protective capacity of its lord, other NPCs could spawn or immigrate to fill other positions such as farmers or fishermen. The lord's reputation partly determined what kind of NPCs would appear. Having more or less figured out the basics, Jake mulled over various strategies before remembering something. "Hey Will, can you play an instrument?" He blurted out casually. Why are you asking me that? I played drums and a little guitar when I was younger. I have a musician roll card. Jake clarified as he shared the card's contents. I thought it would fit you like a glove, so I set it aside for you. As he read the perks on the card at hand, Will tripped and had to hold on to his sleeve to keep himself from falling over. Come on, of course I'm interested. Ever since I lost my Charizard, this ordeal has become a living hell. Jake almost choked on his own spit upon hearing this. After the space dimension of their bracelet was sealed, the businessman had indeed lost contact with his baby dragon. Cough, cough. Did you really name your dragon Charizard? Why not? It's half as big already, and it spits fire. Plus, Tim and Lily picked the name. But his scales are green. Whatever. After giving him the musician card, Jake then chatted with Tim and the two sisters. The three were not in the same village as Will originally, and had only joined him a day earlier. Sorry about Lily. Jake patted the teen's shoulder in a vain attempt to cheer him up. Tim's expression darkened when Jake mentioned his girlfriend. It's my fault, he lamented wistfully. My luck betrayed me for the first time. We didn't teleport to the same village. Oh, Jake had expected the two lovebirds to have been teleported together and a serious accident to have occurred, but the truth was much more ordinary. Tim felt bad about it, but it was actually much more realistic that his luck would disappoint him from time to time. After all, with the ether density of this world, his 100 ether luck points were severely devalued. If Tim wasn't directly responsible for Lily's death, there was nothing to mope about. However, when he considered the girl's age and the fact that she may have been separated from her father for the first time, he felt that this failure may have caused her mental health to suffer. After the ordeal, in addition to saving Kyle's sister, he would have to make sure that Lily did not retain any after effects of her untimely death. As for the two sisters, they had done well. For one, they hadn't been separated, and for two, their initial role was that of nobles, and it couldn't have been better. In addition to occupying a manor together, they had the privilege of directly starting each round with 100M worth of fluid. It was then up to them to spend or grow this fortune wisely. With their decent strength and perfect cooperation, they had no trouble standing out in the last round. Had it not been for two Inquisitors and Avishanmen in the same round as them, the Lord role would have ended up in their hands. In addition to their status as nobles, they had also acquired the Enforcer role since then by successfully eliminating a criminal. You're saying Avi got the Lord role from your village? That's a pretty good thing. Jake commented without being too surprised. Gordon Mason, as an insignificant senior officer, had managed to make the majority of the natives eat out of his hand. For the Titan Pearl General, this was the BARE minimum to expect. As for Aaron, she had been separated from Surai, who according to his bracelet had already been eliminated. At least that was one less person to protect. Jake consoled himself. The young woman had simply been saved by the bell because one of the inquisitors in her village had on his own initiative eliminated all the monsters in the round. Too weak to shine, she had barely achieved anything since their separation. The return trip took longer than the outward journey, as they had to take the winding paths around the forest, but half an hour later they safely made it to their destination. A guard he had never seen before easily recognized him and blew a horn to report his arrival. The villagers nearby were attracted by the commotion and quickly gathered around to take a look. Jake. Aside from these two men, these 5 are part of my faction. Unexpectedly, the witch showed signs of jealousy when she heard that they were members of his faction. Not to mention, a woman could recognize a rival when she met one. Even though Enya and Essia hid their curves under a thick coat, their beauty was undeniable. What, you want to join us? Jake chuckled. Why not? She countered frankly. I already signed a servant contract. It won't make much difference. Jake opened his mouth, but will beat him to it with his most glorious merchant smile. Welcome to our company. The businessman shook her hand energetically without giving her the slightest chance to shake it off. Welcome to the Murtharian Nerds. Upon hearing the full name of their faction, Kawani immediately regretted it. Her face sank, but it was too late to change her mind. With Will's persuasive words, she let herself be led through the procedure like a toddler learning to walk. By the time she realized the extent of her actions, it was too late. The Murtharian Nerds had gained a new member. Chapter 443 Under Attack. What? You're one of the monsters. Will was aghast when he learned of Kawani's roles a few moments later. For the sake of privacy, they had all gone to the castle. The dining table was far too large for them, but there were enough chairs. No more creaking pine chairs. The new upholstery was so comfy that they could even sleep in it. Svara, Drastin, Peter, and Carmen had also met them there after learning that the castle was the Lord's residence. Upon hearing that Kawani had joined Jake's faction, Svara and Peter also chose to enter the Murtharian Nerds. Svara was already his slave and didn't care much about her reputation, while Peter was even easier to convince. As long as he got his dose, he made an excellent subordinate. Drastin was a lone warrior and he knew too little about them to make that decision, so he politely declined but promised to think about it. As for Carmen, she looked hesitant for a bit, but she also refused in the end. The reason was simple. She was already a member of another faction known as Pure Blood. Relax, Will. Jake played it down as he munched on a chicken leg. I've got my eye on her, and she signed a servant contract. Can T get much safer than that? Rewrite. Sorry, Kawani. That's okay. The young woman reassured him before grumbling. Damn it. If I had known your faction skills were this cool, I would have applied earlier. I feel like a brand new person. Everyone burst out laughing. Our leader has his shortcomings, but his Murtharian bloodline is a cheat. Essia nudged him, giggling. Enough with the jokes. Jake ended the fun. We need to find the others. Except for Vincent, who will be here soon, I can't get in touch with them. Does anyone have any leads? They all shook their heads. I haven't seen Kevin or Daniel since we split up. Enya said flatly. We can try to locate them with the bracelet, but if they're too far away, it could be complicated. Will suggested without insisting. In the end, they decided to let fate do its work. Anyway, if they survived long enough, they would find each other sooner or later. Tim and Aaron, what are your roles? Jake changed the subject. Wild child, Tim said proudly. Farmer. Aaron blushed as she announced her role. So far, it was by far the most mundane one on the team. Having never heard of Tim's role, he asked him to share the information with the group. Villager, wild child, unique chooses a model at the beginning of the round and can use the same roles. He cannot vote against or attack this participant, nor can this participant harm him. He can make his choice again at each round. He cannot acquire new roles as long as he has this role. If he loses his model, he becomes a monster. Prerequisite, must be under 16 years old. As expected from their luck specialist, this card was interesting. Nevertheless, Jake saw it as more than a good pick. This result supported his theory that their initial roles were not randomly distributed. From the beginning, neither Jake nor any of the people under his protection had drawn this card. They were all adults, and for them this card was totally unnecessary. Who was your role model in the previous round? Jake inquired. Some Inuit named Keelet. Tim said. A weird guy, with the shaman role. Jake was intrigued. Turning to Kawani, he checked. Is that the male version of your role? I don't think so. It sounds different. The Indian woman firmly denied it. What did it consist of, Tim? I've already forgotten. I didn't understand how it worked. Tim admitted honestly. Something about a curse. The procedure was quite complex and required the collection of many items, including the victim's blood and hair. There were other rituals available, but I didn't try to use them. The reason I chose it was because my danger sense and my luck drove me to it. And I probably did the right thing. Half the deaths in my round were unexplainable. People were dropping dead in the street in the middle of the day, and no one understood why. I could have warned them, but I chose to keep my mouth shut. Your danger sense, I presume? Will scoff gently. Precisely. Have you picked out who's going to be your model this round yet? Jake refocused the conversation. It's already done. The teenager nodded triumphantly. And who is it? Of course it's you. Oh boy, your roles are even cooler than I expected. Tim chuckled contentedly. The teenager's exuberance made everyone interested in his roles, and they were amazed when they heard about his roles and the award he got at the end of the previous round. I should have put in more effort. Enya grouched. We were taking it easy during the first round, but that's going to change. Drastin and Svara in particular harbored similar regrets. They continued to chit-chat a bit more about the things they had missed while they were apart, and then Peter led them to Gordon's house to take care of the immigration paperwork. The officer groused a bit, but with a bit of coaxing from the guards he complied. If you want to go, no one's stopping you. The guard sneered. Those are the Lord's exact words. After this reminder, the bailiff did his job with more gusto than ever, and the procedure was completed in an instant. Will was given an empty grocery store, while the two sisters occupied one of the villas on the same hill as Ostrexera. To avoid any incident, Jake took the opportunity to accompany them, but halfway to the top of the hill, the horn of a sentry guard blared throughout the village. Almost at the same time, the cathedral bell tower began to chime. Looking in the direction of the din, they saw a giant mushroom cloud a few miles away and several villagers fleeing the scene. On the opposite side of the road, a squad of armored Orda were running towards the site of the incident. It only took them one look to realize that the entire southern portion of the village closest to them had just been razed. Boom! The roar of the explosion reached them several seconds later, testifying to the kilometers separating them. We're under attack, a villager cried out as he went to retrieve his sword from his residence. Jake also saw Drastin and Svara braving the crowd to reach the scene. Restoring his air telescope, he surveyed the devastated area and immediately spotted a group of hooded individuals fleeing the scene. It was only when he heard the guards bugle again that he realized they were also under attack. The guard with the horn and 3 of his colleagues were resisting as best they could to a score of guardsmen in coats of mail and red tunics. On the lake side, one of the fishing boats suddenly caught fire, and Jake spotted a weird drakkar filled with Viking-like men and women. Each of them had a creepy face and a look to dead kittens. The invaders raised their bows again, and a barrage of flaming arrows rained down on the other SHIPs tied to the harbor. One of the natives under his protection was even shot in the eye with an arrow. As soon as the drakkar hit the shore, the Vikings inside shouted their war cries, and the troop of enemies poured into the village like an unstoppable tide. The nearby villagers continued to flee, but the guards stepped up to the front. Loot everything, shouted the thunderous voice of a man holed up in the boat. Exterminate all who resist. Whoever brings me the Lord's head will be rewarded with an unassailable card and 100 m of fluid. Jake's face sank as he recognized whose voice it was. The explosion in the south was clearly just a diversion to divide his forces. Daryl, he rasped as he clenched his fists. Focusing, he also recognized Avro's surfer's haircut and Luke's bowler hat. Very well. I'm curious to know what gives you that courage. Jake gritted his teeth. This was the first time he'd been messed with so directly. Forgetting the hazards of corruption, a blast of heat was released from his body, and he turned into a shooting star. 6 seconds later, the drakkar was sunk as if it had just been hit by a stray intercontinental missile. The debris from the ship fell all over the village, while a tidal wave of about 10 meters hit the harbor and the nearby shores because of the shock wave. A moment later, Jake reappeared in a huff on the water's surface right in the dead center of the wreckage area. Water vapor was escaping from him, blurring his appearance behind a screen of mist. Did I get them? Just as he began to doubt, his instincts caused him to tilt his head back out of sheer reflex, and he saw the tree trunk on the bank to his right shatter. A quarter of a second later, he heard the gunshot. Luke Wham? How did he get out of the Drakkar? Jake wondered with genuine perplexity. If the shooter had made it out in time, then that was all it took to conclude that he hadn't hit anyone. Indeed, when he scanned the sea floor with Murtharian's sight, he found nothing but charred fish. The Drakkar was empty. Chapter 444 Air Crash. Clap, clap, clap. Jake, you didn't think we'd forget you, huh? Avro's figure appeared on the soaked wooden dock in the harbor. Jake frowned. He couldn't tell how they had gotten out of the Drakkar in time. The most convenient way was for them to be so fast that he didn't see a thing, but that was unlikely or they wouldn't have fled during the first round. An illusion? Jake deduced. But made by whom? He looked around for the person responsible, but even deploying his spirit body, his search was fruitless. Don't bother. You won't find him. The Australian taunted him, his eyes filled with contempt. Jake ignored the two players and carried on with his search. Stealthily, he used ether conversion to convert the pure ether in his ether core to extrasensory perception and activated Murtharian's sight to scan the area. He also tested observing the surroundings through the filter of his fluid core. A couple of seconds later, his vision detected a presence 50 meters above him. Found you. A normal human wouldn't have noticed, but to a trained mind, the faint psychic signature was impossible to mistake. In fact, a keen eye was enough. The artificial blue sky was cloudless and uniform, but with sufficiently sharp eyesight, it was still possible to pick out micro-anomalies. The illusionist was clearly not talented enough to affect his brain like the second ordeal's blue soul stones. He depended on skillful light manipulation for his staging, and there was a limit to his precision and thoroughness. Bang! A ball of air pierced the mirage above his head with no warning, and a shadow shot out of the way, only to flee for his life the next instant. Recognizing Daryl, Jake immediately flew after him. Seeing the Murtharian take the bait, an evil smile appeared on Avro's face. It's done. The Australian bowed to a shaded wall with no one there. Begin the operation. A raspy, metallic voice squeaked from the shadows. At your command, my lady. Is something bothering you? The shadow observed patiently, waiting for the man to speak up. Avros hesitated shortly before saying, What about Daryl? He lost his fluid card in the previous round, and, with all due respect, I don't think he can outrun Jake for long. A dreary laughter erupted without fixed location, seeming to reverberate all around the Australian. Sometimes the laughter came from his right, and the next moment it would come from his left or above him. A fluid master who runs away from an otherworldly alien is of no use to me. The voice scorned harshly after regaining its seriousness. I understand, but that doesn't answer my question. Avros winced. If Jake comes back too soon, it could get ugly. Don't worry. I never counted on Daryl to carry out this diversion. When you know as much as I do, predicting a youngster's actions is a breeze. Jake caught up with Daryl in a matter of seconds, as Daryl was clearly not used to aerial chases. He didn't try to convince him to stop for a friendly chat. Instead, with no remorse, he slashed down. The fluid master dodged at the last moment without turning around, but his back was lacerated deeply despite his quick response. He thought he had barely made it, but a crippling pain down the wound told him he was done for. Behind him, Jake watched mercilessly as the healer's back melted and cauterized, releasing a foul, burnt smell. He had hit him with a white-hot blade powered by his sharpening ether. In addition to being monstrously sharp and burning hot, the blade was nearly as radioactive as the reactor core of a nuclear power plant. Without proper precautions or sufficient constitution, it was impossible to escape alive. Feeling his death approaching, Daryl mobilized his fluid to stimulate his cells, but this only slowed his cells' necrosis imperceptibly. Meanwhile, Jake casually raised his blade again. Sweating profusely and wheezing, the doctor was on the verge of fainting. Gritting his teeth, he deployed his rectangular shield formation, each one a fluid artifact, then once inside activated the healing spell conferred by his healer role. His wounds instantly healed, and he could finally catch his breath. However, just as he was recovering from his trauma, a shrill whirring sound pierced his eardrums. while a raging headache knocked him unconscious for a split second. His shield formation withered like petals on a wilted flower, and the fluid master tumbled toward the lake. Jake took advantage of this opening to swoop down and slice him into dozens of pieces with his machete. A blink of an eye later, a shower of guts and blood fell into the lake, attracting marine predators from miles around. Jake braked hard, generating an impressive counterwave. Then with a supersonic burst of speed, he spun around and propelled himself in the opposite direction. "Daryl is dead," Avro said as he saw a change in one of his ordeal missions. "Don't worry about him and get on with the operation." The raspy, metallic voice ignored his concern, but the presence vanished after that. The Australian was heartened to see his mysterious lady take action. No one had seen her face, but anyone who had experienced her intent knew that resisting her was simply suicide. As he sped up, Jake felt his wrath spike to record levels, but it was the frustration of being targeted so quickly that had him on edge. If he had known that the second round would commence immediately after the first, he would never have given his enemies time to establish themselves. Infuriated, without realizing it, he began to stimulate the silver alloy in his cells to push his limits even further. His already blazing speed soared even higher, to match that of the best fighter jets. Bursts of white flame shot out of his feet to propel him even faster, and his telekinesis tamed the air to reduce friction to a near sidereal vacuum. At this speed, his village soon reappeared before his eyes. Jake saw the flames rising to the sky from his ruined castle, the houses destroyed, and the bloody corpses of guardsmen and villagers strewn across the cobblestone roads painted with blood and guts. When he saw his allies fighting back to back against a horde of enemy guardsmen far beyond the capabilities of a single village, his heart leapt in his chest. Will's corpse was already lying on the ground in a pool of his own blood. Fuckng bast. Jake's skull hit something hard. Horribly hard. At over 2,000 kilometers per hour, and with no protection other than his stone skin and a thin force field, he smashed head first into a translucent barrier as hard as diamond. The shockwave on impact created multiple ripples on the surface of the invisible barrier, which was nothing more than a masterfully placed force field. The consequences were dramatic. His skull caved in like the shell of an egg thrown against a rock, and part of his brain splattered the barrier. His spine snapped under the blow, and his head sank into his torso about 10 centimeters deep. Even so, Jake was not dead. His spirit body took over, his rage fueling the remnants of his consciousness to keep him from fainting. Completely confused and in shock, he tried to make sense of what had just happened, but he was barely able to formulate a coherent thought. He had clearly hit something, but there was nothing in front of him. If it wasn't for his brain being plastered all over it, he might still be wondering what the hell had just happened. It was the most flawless barrier he had ever seen, and he would not have been at all surprised if its creator turned out to be the god of window cleaners. This was his last intelligible thought. His vision blurred as he lost feeling in his limbs, and he had just enough time to give she the reins before he was devoured by the abyss of a dreamless sleep. Once he passed out, the levitating force that held him up was removed, and he fell into the water with a loud splash. As soon as he landed in the water, he began to sink, and the choppy crimson lake water engulfed him. Once Jake was swept into the depths of the lake, a black hooded figure materialized behind the translucent barrier. What a fearsome fellow! The individual made no secret of its obsession. I thought he would have died instantly, but he still had a breath of life left. Impressive. 3 other figures appeared behind this first person. They too were wearing long black hooded coats, but where their faces should have been, there was only an ocean of darkness. "Shall we retrieve his remains, Grand Master Isbius?" one of the inquisitors asked respectfully. According to our recent investigations, some of these aliens have demonstrated abilities that even the consortium cannot explain. Grandmaster Isbius considered the question for a breath before agreeing. "If I intervene in person, it may trigger an escalation of unwanted consequences. Coiron and Oxium, I leave that to you. If you still haven't found him by tonight, forget it. The lake is deeper than you can imagine, and even lower is the pit. In his condition, the chances of him making it out are slim." The 2 appointed inquisitors bowed and dove into the lake like 2 northern gannets. After that, the 2 remaining figures melted away like 2 malfunctioning holograms, and the lake returned to its original tranquility. Chapter 445 Near-Death Experience. Oracle Heal activated. Number of Oracle Heals remaining for this ordeal, 0/1. As soon as Jake had sunk deep enough and she was sure the resulting light wouldn't alert their enemies, she triggered the Oracle skill to save him. This was the upside of their enhanced mental link. Even if Jake was passed out, she could take over just fine. His ruined body was swathed in an emerald light, and in less time than it takes to blink, he reverted to his original healthy self. Even better, as with Chinin, who found his arm strengthened to handle the strain caused by his oversized arm, Jake's forehead bone doubled in density, while his neck muscles were also strengthened accordingly. If he wanted to, Jake could now develop a headbutt skill and crush all his foes. Yet, he did not regain consciousness. His mended body kept sinking like a log with no reaction at all. But this did not worry she. High in the sky, a ghostly figure, giving off a vague light, was masking its presence behind the blinding brilliance of the sun. Anyone who looked up would see nothing but the rays of a normal star. That phantom was Jake, or rather his spirit body. When he had crashed into the barrier, his brain had been badly damaged. He had lasted a few seconds with his immense constitution and vitality, but eventually he had slipped into a near-death state. It was commonly believed that brain cells could survive for a few minutes before going into necrosis, and it was this window that she used to resurrect him. Of course, on Earth, even if we could have saved him, he would probably have ended up a vegetable. However, with his bloodline and the Oracle Heal, the prognosis was much rosier. Upon losing consciousness, his soul had been ejected from his body, and he was left free to wander in this ghostly form. He could still feel a tiny link tying him to his body, but it was precariously fragile. Without she as a bridge, he would have died forever. Or at least his body would have. Once he broke free of his body, Jake didn't actually feel like he was dead. His spirit body wasn't tangible like his body was, but it didn't suffer from the same limitations either. In this form, he could reach a speed inconceivable by mere thought, and it seemed he could think much better. His body stats were excellent, but ultimately they were different from his spirit body stats, which he couldn't properly see. There was only one way to measure his soul strength, and that was through his spirit body level. Lastly, the radiation and heat attribute that his soul had obtained in the past was already showing its usefulness. Just by exposing himself to the sun's rays, he could feel his spirit body slowly but surely strengthening. It wasn't as fierce as the green lava, but it was more bearable. It was the difference between walking and sprinting. Both were good for your health, but the former was less traumatic for your body. Hiding beneath the sun, Jake listened silently to the conversation between Grandmaster Isbius and her 3 inquisitors. The anger of the earlier instant that had cost him dearly had departed him, replaced by a growing disconcertment, especially about this Isbius. He had seen this woman before, but he was unable to remember when. Although her face was partially hidden, her oval jaw, her immaculate skin, her nose, and her delicate lips were perfect, but that was also why he was confused. He should have remembered such a person. In any case, he could at least say that this Grandmaster Isbius was physically young, 16, 17 years old no more. The problem was that this observation would get him nowhere. The bodies of fluid wielders were nothing special before the fluid master stage, but they enjoyed a considerable lifespan thanks to the revitalizing properties of fluid. Hence, this woman could very well be 100 years old or more, which didn't help him much. When she ordered Croyern and Oxium to find his remains, Jake knew it was time to leave. He didn't have much time left anyway. She had already cast the Oracle Heal, and the link connecting him to his body was rapidly strengthening. The next thing he knew, he was back in his own body, and he felt momentarily suffocated as he reconnected with his brain. He almost felt like one of those claustrophobics stuck in a broken-down elevator. Fortunately, he wasn't dead for long, and he soon found his feet. His forehead and neck were a little thicker than before, but nothing too bothersome. These minor problems would be taken care of in time. I'm in no hurry to die again. He whined inwardly, cracking his neck. And I'm in no hurry to see your head digging into your chest like a nail. Don't forget that we share our senses. She gave him an ear bashing. Sorry. He chose to keep his mouth shut rather than retort. He knew how badly he had screwed up this time. If it weren't for she, he'd be dead for sure. The Inquisitors will be here soon. She returned to her usual strictness. I'm on it. Jake wasn't worried about the two inquisitors diving in after him. With his extreme diver and a fish and water glyphs, he was in his element. Even if they proved to be competent, he was confident that he could escape them. Nevertheless, after his near-death experience, he would not underestimate anyone ever again. Breathe in, breathe out. From now on, he would strive to keep the corruption in check. He had seen what happened when he let go. Taking advantage of the water's cloudiness, Jake deliberately dove to the depths this time, but diagonally, so that the inquisitors could not determine his position from the original spot where he had sunk. Sadly, his efforts proved futile. He had forgotten the inhuman foreknowledge of high-level fluid wielders. Like a school of piranhas that smelled blood, the inquisitors drifted straight toward him, trusting their instincts. They didn't know if he was alive or not, but as long as they had that sixth sense, it was almost like having a shadow guide showing them the way. Master, you can mislead them with your fluid. You are also a peak fluid adept. The subservient and agitated voice of the ghost he had saved suddenly echoed below him. Scanning the depths, he finally discerned the ethereal outlines of the 50-something ghost. You're back. Jake beamed telepathically. I am, Master, the ghost said respectfully, while bowing. Did you accomplish the mission I gave you? Jake pressed him with a mixture of hope and foreboding. The ghost remained silent for several seconds, then gave a toothy grin. It's done. I've found out what happened to the previous expeditions and who was behind it all. I also think I've found the identity of my murderer, or at least the mastermind behind it all. Oh, Jake was leaning toward a player as the murderer, partly because of the tattoo many of the participants wore and the comparison to him. But the two were not mutually exclusive. He hadn't seen any natives with tattoos so far, but it wasn't nearly enough to rule out the possibility. In truth, it made perfect sense that the mastermind would be a native of this world, like Daryl, who was originally a dormant spy for the First Brotherhood. If we followed this trend, there were probably spies working for the other brotherhoods on board the Titan Pearl. On the other hand, such sabotage would take time to set up. If you included the fact that the previous 22 expeditions had all ended up here as drifting shipwrecks, it was even more obvious. This was not something a player who had just come out of hypersleep for a few minutes could accomplish. On the other hand, a player could be given the identity of a spy for another brotherhood or the consortium, or even a saboteur. Anything was possible. In the end, he could not rule out any scenario. Jake wanted to know more, but when his Murtharian sight detected two energy signatures approaching at high speed, he took his lumps and started swimming again. At this rate, they'll catch up with us in less than 3 minutes. She told him soberly. We have to find a solution. Old ghost, you were a fluid wielder too, right? Jake thought back to what the ghost had said when he arrived. Yes, but my talent paled in comparison to Master. Based on the bits of memory I have left, I was a fluid knight in the beginning stage. It's enough. Tell me how to lure them. Jake asked urgently. In the end, it turned out that controlling fluid wasn't very challenging compared to ether. If he listened to the fluid with his gut and not his intellect, manipulating this energy came naturally. The best part was that after he did the drill once, he would remember it for the next time. This was not the case with lesser fluid wielders, as evidenced by the fluid ghost's jealous pout. Their fluid sensitivity was too low to allow for this kind of epiphany. Once Jake caught the trick, he put it into action at once. His senses plugged into the ambient fluid through his fluid core, and without quite understanding how and why, he emitted a sort of untraceable counter-signal, which quickly reverberated throughout the entire fluid fabric of this universe. With his task completed, Jake veered off in a different direction. As expected, the two inquisitors kept following his previous course, and he rejoiced when he saw their energy signature fade into the distance. Now that he had lost them, it was time for him to return to the village to find out what had befallen his friends. With a bit of luck, he might even be able to save some of them. Chapter 446 True Will. Look at your ordeal missions. I'm afraid you got carried away for nothing, she remarked patronizingly, but also pityingly. Jake accessed the interface and sighed guiltily at the roster of people under his protection. All the natives were dead, including Gordon and Carl. The latter's respect for the Inquisitors had apparently not been enough to redeem his life. Their grayed-out names left no room for ambiguity. On the other hand, and this was what made him regret his outburst, Will and the other players had somehow made it through. Errol's and Will's dead bodies that he had witnessed on the way back were probably just illusions induced by Isbius barrier. He tried to replay those last memories before impact, but he failed to find the slightest flaw that could have helped him to prevent this. His visual memory was practically photographic, so he could already conclude that this female Grandmaster's illusions were at least 2 notches above Daryl's. May his bastard soul rest in peace. By now, his remains were probably feeding the lake's fish. He'd done something stupid, but at least he'd gotten rid of that SCU bag. Not such a bad outcome all in all. He reached the destroyed village in no time, but forced himself to stay submerged until he was out of breath before resurfacing. If the Inquisitors did not find his body, it was a safe bet that the village would be their next destination. And indeed, he had made the right choice. Croyern and Oxium flew over the village soon after. With his Murtharian sight, he saw them patrolling in a circle twice around the smoldering rubble. Then after an exchange of glances they shrugged and wafted away. Ugh, finally gone. Jake cursed after taking a deep breath of fresh air. We could have fought them, Master, the fluid ghost said in disappointment. Since he had died, he seemed to have lost some basic human emotions, like fear. Unless he had died precisely because his self-preservation instinct had always been non-existent, it was worth looking into. Regardless, now that the old ghost was with him, he could now enjoy a crash course. To find Will and the others, he learned to listen to what the veteran fluid wielders called the fluid whisper. Of course, the fluid couldn't actually talk, but that was how the fluid wielders described the feeling they experienced when they felt that elusive sense of omniscience. Usually it was only at the fluid master rank that this precognition became accurate, but he was currently very close to that level. At least, his spirit body and extrasensory perception had long since crossed that threshold. Don't forget about corruption, she said for the umpteenth time. Every time you open your senses and connect with the surrounding fluid, you accelerate its spread. I know, but I've changed my mind, Jake said, clenching his fists in rage. His heart was screaming for blood. I can be careful and delay the corruption's advance, but what if the round drags on? What if there's a third one after that, and then another again? Let's be honest. Unless I can find a way to double my spirit body level every 10 days, I only give myself a week before I lose it. Sorry, but I should as well embrace it. I won't try to change your mind again, but consider the corruption from a different angle. She compromised, though she did not hide her concern. Let's say you win this ordeal, but in order to do so you end up murdering, torturing, raping, and betraying everyone you care about, allies and enemies alike, the innocent as well as the wicked. Will you still be able to look at yourself in the mirror after that? Maybe the Oracle can heal your mind, but can it undo the evil you've done? Jake's face twitched. He was a man first and foremost. Before civilization, some cruel behavior that modern society would consider sinful was commonplace, and sometimes even looked up to. Even monkeys and dolphins were capable of perpetrating the worst atrocities within their own communities if allowed to act in accordance with their nature. Although he was convinced that he would never lay a hand on a woman against her will or betray his friends, could he really be so sure of that? From the beginning, she had repeatedly warned him about the malevolent nature of this corruption. If it merely disinhibited them and exacerbated their emotions, it didn't deserve to be called evil. At worst, it would have been labeled as dangerous. If so, what was his AI really fearing? Was his personality really so fickle that anything could mess it up? Fuckng no. I am a Murtharian. I will not lose to myself. I will win, without perjuring myself. Jake finally declared as a promise to himself. As these words left his mouth, his resolve sparked to life, and he felt something change within him. The ether runes of his silver Murtharian bloodline began to shimmer forth from an immeasurably small point lodged in the very core of his spirit body. Without him doing anything, the rune's glow spread to his entire spirit body, and then his physical body. His muscles and skin began to radiate like a mini sun, in a way not dissimilar to his berserk mode. Before he could even understand what was happening to him, everything stopped. If the sand of the shore under his feet had not vitrified, he could have believed he had imagined it. True will 1 point. Jake froze for a long minute as he read this, somewhat bewildered. Until now, he had always considered willpower to be a sub-attribute of intelligence, and that was still the case. Willpower was a very subjective concept. It depended very much on personality, and many scientists even considered that it did not exist, or at least that it was very limited. Depending on the place felt, the stakes, or the urgency of the task, even a person considered lazy could suddenly become a workaholic. So what did willpower and true will mean? Willpower, as he understood it, was his mental resilience and self-control. In medical terms, it was his rational prefrontal cortex dominating over his limbic, emotional brain. He could always decide to slack off or run away from his chores and duties, but with a high willpower stat he would not give up easily, nor would he break down in front of an overwhelming task. In that case, what was the purpose of this true will stat? It's pure mental force. All your values, your determination, and everything else that defines you, such as your ether code, condensed into an indestructible particle of energy. Even if your body and spirit body were to fall apart, this spark of true will would remain as the last barrier shielding your soul. She explained with awe and reverence. Evolvers and high-level etherists can condense their true will to perform all sorts of miracles. Awakening one's will is an absolute prerequisite for becoming an Oracle Guardian. If it's a prerequisite to becoming an Oracle Guardian, then why are you so emotional? Jake couldn't help but ask. Because true will is usually condensed around the 5th or 6th ordeal, and only by the most talented. It is estimated that it requires a willpower sub-attribute of over 10,000 points, as well as a spirit body level above 25. Even with these requirements, it's not always enough. Sorry for my lack of faith, Jake, but no matter how good you are, this shouldn't have happened now. Jake didn't take offense. He dismissed all possible hypotheses before isolating a plausible explanation. The only one, to be honest, the silver alloy in his cells. The result of the red, blue, and green soul stones fusion he had ingested during his second ordeal. Its only effect so far had been to change his bloodline's name to Silver Murtharian, to harmonize his figure, and to optimize the growth of his cognitive stats. That's all well and good, but how do I use it? Jake suddenly realized that this happy event wasn't helping him much. No idea. She sheepishly apologized. You awakened it too soon. My memory of this faculty is still hazy, but now I have a little more confidence in you for this ordeal. She paused for a moment, then added weakly, crush them all. Jake smiled as he heard her heartfelt encouragement. I will. A few minutes later, he found Will and the others at the edge of the forest. They were alive and well, but it had been a close call. Will was ironically unharmed, but Tim had taken a big hit. When he saw the kid looking like a pincushion with 9 arrows sticking out of his chest, he realized it was the first time he'd ever seen him injured. Fortunately, his armor had prevented the arrows from going in too deep. The others had taken a few stray bullets or arrows, but no vital organs had been harmed. They were now resting against the trees, their wounds neatly bandaged. Drastin, the only one with Will who had escaped completely unscathed, was standing guard. You are alive. Enya hugged him when she saw him approach. We saw you fall into the lake after you smashed into that fence. Speak frankly. Jake chuckled. You saw my head go so deep into my chest that you wonder why my chin doesn't smell like my asshole, right? Don't worry, it takes more than that to kill me. It's time for payback. Chapter 447 New Plan. Jake then noticed that Carmen was not among them. Where did Carmen go? He asked Svara and Kawani nosily. Unlike the villagers and players under his protection, Carmen was not one of his protégés nor part of his faction. They exchanged unsettled looks and shook their heads apologetically. I haven't seen her since the assault began. Drastin also testified grimly. Peter fought with us, but we lost sight of each other during the fight. Jake checked his ordeal missions and found Peter Brady's name in the list. The drug addict was very much alive and kicking. Whatever, I'll just let him do what he wants for now. He shrugged. What are you going to do now, Jake? Will asked concernedly. I was optimistic an hour ago, but now it's going to be hard to get back on track with a burned-out village. You're wrong. Jake objected calmly. I never cared about the buildings. Sure, it's cool to have a place to sleep, but it was never essential to my plan. But these game buildings have their uses. The businessman argued quietly. It was part of his job to find out stuff, and he'd duly done his homework. For starters, they are virtually indestructible against normal methods, and there are bonuses to be gained from certain builds. For example, your Lord role will be unusable until you rebuild the castle. Jake had a bad feeling when he heard this. He pulled out his fluid card and looked at his role list. A cursory glance confirmed to him, alas, that was telling the truth. FUCK. How did they do it? Jake brought up the most crucial issue with his newfound lucidity. To almost destroy my wooden hut in the first round, I needed all my berserk mode power. I refuse to believe that these players or inquisitors are powerful enough to destroy an entire village in such a short time. I know that Avros, one of the attackers, has a role or an item that allows him to destroy buildings, but I don't know more than that. What's this Avros' initial role? Well asked, so seeking an eyebrow. Monster, and Mason if my memory serves me right. Kawani replied while scratching her chin with her forefinger. Will let out a plethora of curses upon hearing this. It was rare for him to lose his temper like that. Look no further. He has the Demolisher role. It's a rare role, which requires the Mason role as a prerequisite as well as a certain amount of materials to make explosives. These explosives are nothing special if used against us, but they are frighteningly effective on the game buildings. Jake was not as downcast as his comrade. Quite the opposite, he had regained some of his optimism. He recalled the sticks of dynamite Avros had used in their fight. If it was enough to keep him from planting his bombs, it was perfectly within his capabilities. I don't want to play devil's advocate, but you're overlooking something. Enya interjected, arms crossed. Other than the cataclysmic explosion in the village south of ours that served as a diversion, I haven't seen or heard a single explosion. If I had to go out on a limb, I'd say the buildings were set on fire. So either they have a pyromaniac, or this Avros arsenal is not limited to bombs. In the case of the castle and the other stone mansions, it was obviously sabotaged from the inside. So they have at least one thief who can pick locks, or a locksmith to make duplicates. Makes sense. Jake nodded. We need to find another Mason now, since they killed all the native villagers. If any of you have the roll card, pass it to me. I'll rebuild the village my way this time. I dare them to destroy the new castle once I put my own spin on it. Drastin, Kawani, and Svara were somewhat skeptical, but the others chuckled knowingly. These guys had really messed with the wrong person if they thought they could demoralize him by destroying a few houses. To be fair, you couldn't really blame them. Right now, they thought his corpse was feeding the fish. The village's destruction was just a bonus. I have the roll card, Drastin said flatly, but building is not my specialty. I prefer fighting. Perfect, Jake smiled. After equipping the roll, he called out, Now let's get to work. Wait, Jake. Will stopped him. Remember, this is still a game. Like witches' potions, you need recipes, or rather in this case blueprints, and specific materials. The first building to be rebuilt after the castle will be the barracks so the guards can resurrect. Damn it, Jake grunted. And how do we get those blueprints? Should we plunder the other village's masons? By the way, how do you claim another village if you're not one of those citizens? I endorse that idea. Drastin roared fiercely as he gripped his huge war hammer with eagerness to fight. I'm all for it too. Svara and the two sisters nodded. Tim, who was still lying down from his injuries, raised his head and bellowed, I'm in. I want to find the mother that you Dasid Kur who fired all his arrows at me and shove his bow all the way up his. Shut up, Tim, Will snarled before massaging his brain, burdened with tremendous weariness. Let me handle this. Our enemies think you're dead for now, and that's a good thing. I still have my store in Scour's village. We can ask Avi. Essia reluctantly offered. Let's do that then. Jake complied with a displeased expression. What the fuck was he supposed to do while waiting for them to come back? The group then split into 3 groups. The two sisters, Svara and Kawani, went to Avi Shanmin's village, while Will returned to negotiate with Scour under Drastin's protection and his 2 bodyguards. The latter were apparently native fluid knights, won over by his charisma. He would also take the chance to get the musical instrument he needed for the musician role. In the end, only Tim, still convalescent, stayed with him. Jake first traversed the forest to investigate the village to the south where the explosion had originated and there found a smoldering, wrecked city. He had assumed that Avros and the others were targeting him personally, but perhaps he had been mistaken. After that, he and the teenager quietly returned to their village. Hearing a commotion under the rubble, Jake found the guard captain still alive. He and his horse had been buried by several tons of rubble, but he had somehow made it through. Mael, you're not my lord anymore. The warrior stared at him in a fit of existential crisis, as if he could no longer make sense of the new instructions occupying his memory. How creepy. Even the NPCs are aware of the program screwing with their brains. Jake thought with many doubts. He didn't help him immediately. Instead, he scanned the guard with his bracelet without success, then with his own spirit body and Murtharian sight. When he focused all his perception in his eyes, he sensed something uncanny. So that's how it is. Tim, never trust the guards. Jake ordered telepathically. The teenager nodded without question. Every command from Jake was taken as gospel. Jake then helped the guard clear the debris, then ordered him to search for any survivors. Every extra guard was extra free labor. They visited the castle, as well as other important residences like the bailiffs or the cathedral, but practically nothing was left. The attackers had been extraordinarily thorough in their efforts to burn down everything. In particular, the masons' residence, where they had left nothing, not even the ashes of the tools. As they reached the bottom of the hill, Jake paused in surprise. Looking up at the top, he murmured thoughtfully, "So even you didn't run away?" Climbing the hill at an even pace, Jake strolled up to a ruined mansion. The smell of coal and ash was still prevalent, and a few wisps of black smoke were still billowing from it. Rummaging through the rubble, Ostrexera and Laxmini looked dejected, especially Laxmini, who still looked quite shaken up. "Why are you still here?" Jake broke the silence, which startled the young woman. In comparison, Ostrexera just turned around slowly, as if she had already anticipated his arrival. "Why are you still alive?" she countered with a straight face. Jake grinned. "Let's talk." "What do you want?" he asked gravely. "I know you're not with those other monsters that just attacked, but I also know that compared to you, they're like choir boys." Ostrexera made no effort to deny it. "I want what any monster wants. Killing and eternal rest." A face contorted with untold insanity superseded her usual listlessness. Even someone as battle-hardened as Jake recoiled slightly. "But I only kill men," she added candidly, flashing an angelic smile against all odds. "Okay, she's definitely insane." Jake concluded inwardly, but didn't show any of it. Surely some dude had ruined her life in the past to make her hate men like that. "But I'm a man." He pointed out the one important detail she seemed to have glossed over. "You are." She nodded apathetically again. Jake felt a headache coming on. This was going to be a long discussion. Chapter 448, New Allies. After a long argument, they eventually found common ground. Jake agreed to let her and her allies live here, and in exchange she swore under contract not to harm his villagers and to defend the latter in case of attack. He also forced her to reveal her initial role, clairvoyant. The details of this role were as follows. Villager, clairvoyant, unique. Upgradable, can see the roles of one participant of their choice each cycle. This was only at level 1 though. No matter how hard Jake tried to convince her, she refused to disclose her current level. He did, however, insist that she reveal the circumstances of her monster role, or their previous agreement would be void. This precaution saved him a lot of trouble later on, as it gave him a salutary insight into what they might face in the near future. Monster, Alpha Monster, upgradable. This monster can kill other monsters and attack a second time after the monsters have gone to sleep. Monsters transformed by an Alpha Monster cannot harm it in any way. The Alpha Monster's night form is also superior to that of normal monsters. The more monsters it has underneath it, the stronger this form will be. Requirements. Contaminate 3 inhabitants directly or 6 in total, pyramidal. This role card revealed 2 important things to him. The first was that normal monsters could not attack each other, which made it easier for him to understand why Kawani had ended up in such a predicament during the previous round. The second was the monster's potential to evolve. Jake already knew that their monster form got stronger after each kill, but he didn't know to what extent. Now he knew that they could also evolve by meeting certain conditions. The word pyramidal meant that the villagers infected by the monsters that Kawani had bitten were also considered to be her underlings. Apparently, the restriction of their freedom at night had not changed. The number of attacks remained limited, and with the sole exception of the vagabonds, even the monsters were forced to return home at a certain time. For the normal monsters, it was before midnight. Despite their freedom, the vagabonds' position was not to be envied. All of their roles, if they had any, were unusable, with rare exceptions, as was the case with Jake at the moment. Monsters could still transform, but they would no longer be able to attack houses. At first, Ostrexera was against sharing all this information and even wanted to impose a time limit on their deal and spare only those she deemed worthy. Naturally, Jake had refused outright. The village belonged to him, and she knew for a fact that she would not be accepted anywhere else. Indeed, because of the other village idiots, henchmen, confessors, and other investigative roles, the other village lords had a multitude of methods for cracking her identity. Avros and his gang might have accepted her, but for some reason she seemed to loathe the Australian to the core. She didn't want to be associated with the Inquisitors either. "Where are Helene and Anne?" Jake then asked. In addition to Laxmini and Kawani, these two women were two other monsters that Ostrexera had contaminated, and he wanted to keep an eye on them. The austere woman frowned when she saw that Kawani had divulged everything to him, but in good faith of their new collaboration, she did not withhold anything, and is in the mine looking for fluid gems, while Helene has gone to visit other villages in search of children. A teacher without children has no chance to reach her full potential. The fluid gems were a pitch-black crystal closely resembling a fluid core, but not confined to an ovoid shape. Good luck to her. Jake snickered. The only confirmed living child of the ordeal was Tim, and he was by his side. Maybe Carmen's sister was alive somewhere, but she would have to find her first. With the deal done, Jake scrambled down the hill. Although he wasn't afraid of the ghostly woman, he felt uncomfortable in her presence. It was as if something in the air was making him feverish and that he would end up getting sick if he hung around her too long. From Tim's twitchy shivers, he clearly felt the same way. With nothing else to do for the day, Jake waited for his companions to return in front of the castle. He couldn't show his face too much and risk attracting the attention of their raiders. It was up to Will and the others to act as scouts for a change. Even if he didn't intend to show himself, he couldn't leave either. As soon as Isbius realized he was still alive, she and her inquisitors would return to finish the job. Will hadn't had time to explain everything to him, but it was possible to annex a village without killing the Lord, and in fact without fighting if the Lord chose to submit. Alternatively, the village could be conquered by destroying all important structures and rebuilding the castle or the bailiff's residence by a mason from their own village. Stealing the Lord's letters of nobility or falsifying them was also a solution. Fortunately for him, Avros and his group had come only to destroy and ransack. These morons seemed to have no ambition other than to see the world burn. Jake didn't know if they had always been like this or if the corruption affected their cognition, but he wasn't going to complain. Maybe they were expecting to destroy his letter of nobility by burning down the castle, but tough luck for them. He carried it with him at all times. He didn't know what material the letter was made of, but the ink hadn't smudged after his forced dip in the lake. In the middle of the afternoon, a group of curious players and natives from another village appeared at the entrance to the village. They were armed to the teeth, one of them even carrying a bazooka on his shoulder. In all, he counted 9 people. Their leader had the typical look of a veteran field soldier, with a khaki cap, sunglasses, off-road boots, a bulletproof vest, and a recognizable uniform. He was no longer young and should have been enjoying a comfortable retirement in an office at his age. Jake recognized the Earth emblem sewn onto his epaulette, as well as the silver bar betraying his rank of first lieutenant. Jake watched them calmly without trying to intervene. Sooner or later, they would make it to the castle. After determining that they were not the same group as before, he decided to wait for them there. When they sighted him, they pointed their guns at him, and one of the guys at the back of the group took the liberty of pulling a turned-off tablet from his backpack. His comrade turned it on with a tiny lightning bolt. No doubt a quick way to recharge it in this place without outlets. After a few seconds, the soldier holding the tablet relaxed visibly. "Earthling," he said. The officer did not let his guard down yet. "What faction? A criminal record?" he inquired impatiently. "Murtharian nerds." "No, apparently not," the other soldier promptly informed him. Only after hearing this reply did the lieutenant relax in turn. "Put down your weapons. I am Paveo, from Croatia." The lieutenant introduced himself in a friendly manner, without offering a handshake. "I've heard of you." Jake displayed a bewildered look. What had he done now to make himself known? "Don't worry, there's nothing wrong with you. Colonel Hale asked us to enter the ordeal at the same time as you. There are 2 other teams participating as well. Jake was not thrilled when he heard this. Ruby's so-called adopted aunt was still trying to recruit him, or at least determine if he was worth the money. He didn't bother to ask how they had determined the day of his ordeal. With the Oracle, it was child's play if the level of authority was high enough. No doubt there were higher-ranking people than him at New Earth. What do you want? Jake didn't have time to socialize. The lieutenant much preferred to deal with this type of person. We want to occupy this village. Ours was destroyed yesterday by some monster village. Jake raised a puzzled eyebrow, but he couldn't flinch at the risk of losing the upper hand. Please look elsewhere. I am the lord of this village, he declared stiffly. The soldiers looked at each other before snickering nervously. Jake, being a good man, did not take offense and let them laugh until they had quieted down. Only the officer remained unruffled. Forgive me for being tactless, but you are alone and we are a whole team. Besides, we have 2 masons to rebuild everything and the proper blueprints. Paveo declined apologetically. Who said I was alone? My friends will be back any minute. Jake retorted nonchalantly. Actually, even if I were alone, it wouldn't matter. I alone am enough. The man frowned but didn't get carried away. Instead, he conversed with his companions for a while before walking back to him. Can we stay? Paveo suggested. Let us see what you are capable of before we make our decision. If you're in over your head, I hope you'll agree to let us take over. Sure. Jake accepted numbly. He was sorely lacking in manpower anyway. At sunset, he met up with his cousin Vincent, and a little later with Will, who told him some good news. Enya and Essia did not return in time, and thus prepared themselves to spend their first night under the stars. Chapter 449 Lively Night. Welcome back, Will. How did the negotiation with Scour go? Jake became interested when he caught the smug look on his face. Great. Scour forced me to give up my store. I got your blueprints too. Will chuckled happily. Ignoring Jake, he motioned to Drastin and the 2 fluid knights who had escorted him to unload the 4 carts full of supplies. Drastin himself was loaded like a mule. Jake's facial muscles twitched imperceptibly as he watched this nonsense. Still, he had to get to the bottom of it. So what makes you so happy? He asked this time with barely veiled annoyance. That dumbass Scour let me take all my possessions with me. What a fuckng dork. Will gloated to himself just like a Disney villain. Explain. Jake growled impatiently. Sensing that his leader was not in the mood for jokes, Will regained his gravitas. This situation is fucked up, the businessman said in all seriousness. You haven't realized it yet because the first round had an initial allocation of roles that was pretty much viable. Production roles like farmer, hunter, or fisherman may have seemed useless, but thanks to them, food supplies were guaranteed. As villagers acquire better roles, they abandon their original roles. At the same time, the proportion of monsters, enforcers, etc. only increases while the number of remaining participants decreases. My grocery store's inventory is equivalent to almost all the food in his village. And because this delinquent retard was letting me handle the technical side, he doesn't even know it. He just blew all his efforts with one single bad decision. If he wished, he could bury himself in the ground in the hot sun, and he would be able to subsist for a few months without problems. Even without that, his forest warden role guaranteed that he could hunt to his heart's content. He also realized as he listened to Will that he knew nothing about these production roles. How fast did what they planted grow? How often was the harvest? How quickly were the fish in the lake renewed? Or the beasts in the forest? When he had fallen into the lake, he had been under the impression that he could catch fish without limitation. But could he really? Probably not. If he had tried, he would have been sent to the pit for trespassing. I hadn't considered that, Jake admitted honestly. If we follow that logic, with the corruption's influence, it won't be long before the remaining survivors fall into cannibalism. Exactly. Have you noticed that it's become nearly impossible to pick up a production roll card? Will shared his find with trepidation. Jake's face scrunched up hearing this. I didn't know that. I stopped picking roll cards as soon as I got the rolls I wanted. My focus was not on this. His merchant buddy refrained from the slightest bit of quipping. With his intelligence, if Jake wanted to, he wouldn't have missed any of these details. The only reason he hadn't connected all the dots yet was because as a top-tier player, his focus was elsewhere. And most importantly, he had only arrived in the second round this morning. We can always count on the NPCs for these roles, right? Jake thought about something. You said earlier that they would spawn to fill the village to capacity. They will. Will grunted, recalling bad memories. But unlike the guards, it's not guaranteed. And if they die, the crops are screwed. ULL understand better after tonight. Now help us unpack the supplies. We're going to be living on this for a while. We're not all Murtharian hybrids like you. The group then proceeded to move the supplies to safety. Jake used his earth manipulation powers to dig an underground cave, which he then sealed by smoothing out the rock above. Besides Jake, anyone who wanted to access the supplies without damaging them would need a high-precision drill. And before that, they'd still have to find the stash location. As a precaution, only Will and Jake knew about it. Far from being resourceful, he had simply dug the BAST under the ruins of his old castle. After that, Jake introduced Lieutenant Paveo and the other new Earth soldiers to Will and Drastin. The businessman was somewhat disappointed when he found out that he had made the trip for nothing. Paveo had all the blueprints they needed and plenty more. When night fell, Jake, despite the late hour, suggested starting the construction work, but was met with a unanimous refusal. Except for Drastin, everyone, including Paveo and Will, wanted to keep a low profile. The lieutenant had already redeployed his troops to stand guard tonight. Except for 2 Titan Pearl soldiers he had recruited along the way, everyone else was invisible, hidden somewhere in the rubble. Of course, Jake could still spot most of them, but he had to admit that the 2 snipers were well hidden. Remembering Yerode and Lamine's surprise ambush on B-842, his knees suddenly itched, and he vowed again to finish off the 2 Motherf UT.Kurs at the first opportunity. To be on the safe side, they also insisted on putting out the campfire, and so began his first night in the second round. Despite the protests, Jake had no intention of sleeping it off, and so began to rebuild his new castle, following the blueprint, while Paveo and his troops watched on in Despiel. Will wanted to say something, but he backed down. Seeing Drastin proactively help him, he let go and joined them. In the end, the safest place to be was still right next to Jake. The first part of the night went smoothly. Jake occasionally felt Paveo's snipers pointing their sights at him, but he was alert. The blueprints were simpler than he thought. There were no material requirements. As long as the dimensions and structures were respected, everything would be uniform. He intended to shape the fortress out of a single gigantic block of rock. He would build it step by step, meter by meter, maintaining the cohesion of the lava with his earth control and telekinesis until it cooled down completely. The only real constraint was that the noise had to be limited as much as possible, while the light emitted by the heated rock had to be intercepted at all costs to avoid attracting the attention of possible enemies. For that, Jake used his radiation control. All the photons emitted were captured by his skin, and this made him realize once again how good his Murtharian bloodline was. Every time he remembered that it was only grade 8, he couldn't help but wonder how overcheated a grade 10 bloodline would be. Jake and Drastin had finished rebuilding the hall when they stopped at the same time. Will also stiffened as he noticed their shift in demeanor. "What's going on?" he asked telepathically. "We're under attack." Indeed, a few seconds later inhuman roars sounded not so far from them. Not like those of a lion or a tiger, which could still have their fans, but the disgusting alien-like sounds out of a horror movie. "Tata-tata. Pshtu-boom." Paveo's team opened fire a few seconds later. The soldier with the bazooka had also opened the festivities. Will panicked as he heard the roaring and shooting, but he wasn't completely helpless either. The 2 fluid knights at his side grabbed 2 carbon tubes from their belts, which lengthened into 2 high-frequency, vibrating short swords. "Shouldn't we be hiding?" The businessman was getting fidgety. Drastin scoffed. "No need." Jake yawned in boredom. "We're in the perfect place." Will looked around the stone hall they were in again and couldn't think of anything that could be considered ideal. The room was large, and he had seen no passageways or secret weapons. He got his answer soon enough. A few minutes later, a group of monsters managed to slip through the barrage of gunfire and fearlessly landed in front of them. These monsters were vaguely humanoid with a long tail ending in a club and spine, grayish skin with fur shaped like thin, ugly tentacles. The very definition of a hunter. As soon as the creatures sighted them, they snarled at them, sputtering defiantly. "Gee, they're not participants." Drastin bellowed as he swung his warhammer at the face of the nearest creature. Simultaneously, an ugly head flew through the air along with a gush of alien blood. Is this what you meant, Will, when you said relying on NPCs for supplies would be complicated? Jake commented after decapitating the second monster. The businessman gritted his teeth, and with the help of the two fluid knights, they managed to corner a third creature. The vibrating blades of the two warriors chopped the alien to pieces in no time, while the merchant slashed through its eye with his cutlass. A spurt of warm blood sprayed his face, and he nearly puked. Good for him. The battle was already over. At least, that's what someone wanted them to believe. As the corpses, blood and innards of a score of hunters painted the brand-new hall, two black, cloaked figures entered noiselessly through the non-existent front door. Jake Wilderth, I presume? A raspy, metallic voice broke the status quo. Beyond a doubt, the two Inquisitors Croyern and Oxium had tracked him down. Chapter 450 Showdown with Inquisitors, Part 1. How did you find me? Jake probed in puzzlement. I thought you had to report back to your base if you failed. The two Inquisitors were almost indistinguishable. They wore the same loose-fitting, hooded, inky black robes, and their faces were obscured by a veil of darkness. Yet Jake was able to tell them apart by their slight difference in height and posture, which were subtly different. Croyern seemed to be unduly heavy, and his movements were unnatural despite his remarkable stealth. Oxium, on the other hand, looked more normal, but to someone like Jake who was used to supporting his own mass, the second Inquisitor did not seem to be anchored to the ground, as if he was too light to let gravity influence him. In response to his question, Croyern tilted his head to the side in an unnatural way and remained in that posture, while Oxium answered with an angry rasp, close to a rustle. And we did report. Our master was not happy with our failure. The village not being ours yet, she already knew that somehow you had survived. She gave us a second chance, tonight, and we will do our duty no matter what it takes. Jake and Will frowned. Drastin raised his war hammer and flexed his muscles as a show of strength. Regrettably, the sweat on their faces and clammy hands gave away their nervousness. Truthfully, none of the three were in a hurry to fight these two Inquisitors. If the fight did take place, it would be the most treacherous since the ordeal began. They would be putting their lives on the line this time. Do we really have to fight tonight? Jake tentatively made one last plea, though with little conviction. His hand was already on the hilt of his machete. Of course not. Oxium whispered like a gentle breeze. If you agree to die now, fighting is pointless. Jake was mildly unsettled, but didn't show it. Instead, he snarled back. You'd rather kill me than gain a new ally? Why not turn me into a monster instead? Would you accept? This time it was Croyern's grinding, metallic voice that retorted. Jake hesitated for a second, then sighed somewhat disillusioned. I guess you know me well. Vincent, fire at will. Jake shouted telepathically. In the span of a tenth of a second, a huge projectile pierced the air, bursting out of the darkness at breakneck speed. Croyern, who was the target, barely had time to tilt his torso slightly before he was struck violently. The impact generated a deafening shock wave, and the stone floor of the newly rebuilt hall cracked. Simultaneously, Drastin pumped up his muscles and leapt forward with superhuman speed to bring down his huge warhammer with all his might. Croyern, who had already taken an unknown projectile, was already in a bad position, and his head connected with the warrior's hammer with a loud gong. Jake expected to see the Inquisitor's head explode, or at least be thrown off by the violence of the impact. But what a shock it was when he saw Drastin instead drop his broken hammer to press his swollen left arm. An ugly protuberance protruded from under his wrist, indicating that a major bone had splintered on impact. Croyern had not moved an inch. As for the giant projectile, it was a huge spear, or rather translucent arrow fired by Vincent. It was giving off a mist of cold air and was already melting. Nonchalantly, and as if he couldn't feel the pain, Croyern grabbed the ice spear with one of his gloved hands, and with a twist, it shattered into pieces. Simultaneously, Jake had bombarded Oxium with multiple air bullets to prevent him from rescuing his comrade, but he soon noticed that the Inquisitor was standing idly by, letting the projectiles wash over his robe with indifference. However, he did not stop shooting to ensure that Vincent and Drastin's ambush would be carried out successfully. Sadly, they failed. After firing hundreds of rounds of compressed air, Oxium's hooded robe was riddled with holes. It gradually frayed, then fell apart, revealing a full body armor underneath and an arsenal of tubes hanging from his belt. The plates of the armor were dotted with fine cracks, but they had held firm. Underneath the Inquisitor's hood, there was still a metal helmet with a visor that prevented him from peering into its face. Obviously, they enjoyed cultivating a sense of mystery. By unspoken agreement, the two cousins went into action at the same time. Vincent opened fire on Croyern, while Jake depressurized the air around the two Inquisitors to make them choke. Drastin stepped back and snapped the broken bones back into place. A greenish halo enveloped his forearm, a sign that the ether of vitality was at work. Once again, their attacks proved ineffective. The bullets ricocheted off Croyern with a deluge of sparks, while the lack of oxygen left the two Inquisitors completely unaffected, almost as if they couldn't even tell the difference. Beside him, Drastin inspected his healed arm, opening and closing his fingers in search of any sign of discomfort. The three players exchanged alarmed looks and decided to stop conserving their strength. If these two Inquisitors escaped, who knew what kind of hell they would face next? Drastin suddenly let out a war cry, and a thunderous heartbeat shook the walls of the hall. The Black Warrior suddenly doubled in size, almost reaching 5 meters in height. His arms lengthened until they almost touched the ground. His shoulders widened disproportionately, as did his head, which swelled horribly. His ears became pointed, his nose sunken, his jaw moved forward, while the yellowish fangs of his mandible lengthened until they protruded from his lips. His skin thickened to a texture between leather and bark, and his muscles developed in a disharmonious way. Miraculously, his oversized plate armor managed to accommodate his growth spurt. Somehow, the creator of this armor had foreseen this scenario. Yeah, no doubt, it was a troll. Vincent drew his trusty rapier, and a strange blue halo enveloped his body, condensing at the tip of his blade. Drops of water began to condense one by one along his blade. Then the process accelerated drastically, and all the humidity of the surrounding air converged towards him, enveloping him in a watery veil. Not wanting to be left behind, Jake activated bloodline ignition and switched to lava mode. The blast of heat and light was contained by his telekinesis, though the rock beneath his feet still liquefied in a heartbeat. As for Will, he had already retreated to the far end of the hall with his two bodyguards. It wasn't a matter of courage, but of practicality. Without his summons, he was too vulnerable, and he highly doubted that his charisma would work on these two fellows. For safety, Jake manipulated one of the walls to keep him safe. He hadn't created any secret passages, but he had set up the hall in individually manipulatable blocks so he could easily intervene. To be fair, he didn't expect to use it so soon. Compared to their relaxed demeanor before, the two Inquisitors for once appeared to take the situation seriously. Both activated one of the tubes on their belts to form a dark energy blade, respectively. These blades contained a high-frequency, vibrating metal portion, as well as a layer of fluid with terribly destructive properties. They were an improved version of Daryl's sword. Die! Drastin planted his huge fists into the ground and pulled out a huge boulder. Building up momentum as he shook the hall with each step, he lifted the boulder over his head and leapt into the air. As he fell, he smashed it down on Croyern's skull. The targeted Inquisitor swung his blade upward with dazzling agility and deflected the huge boulder in an inexplicable manner. Shifting his feet, he spun around and planted his weapon successively in the giant foot of the troll, then his two knees before severing his hamstrings and lifting his blade towards his crotch. The black player growled in pain, but unlike what one might have pictured, he managed to muster a sadistic smile. His wounds closed almost instantly after a few large drops of leafy green blood flowed from them. Just as he should have collapsed from the agony of having a blade thrust into his crotch, Drastin vigorously clenched his legs and crushed the arm of the Inquisitor holding the sword. Croyern tried to pull his arm free, but it was too late. The troll's huge fists began to pummel him with enough power to flatten a car like a pancake. Meanwhile, seeing that Drastin was managing, Vincent charged towards Oxium in a flash, leaving a trail of water particles behind him, then backstabbed him without hesitation. On impact, a fine jet of pressurized water shot out of the tip of the blade with enough intensity to slice through steel. A A shrill chime erupted along with numerous splashes, and the Inquisitor's chest armor was pierced clean through. Seeing this first success, he withdrew his blade and stabbed again at a monstrous rate. When Vincent had attacked him from behind, the Inquisitor's attention was already occupied by multiple soul arrows and a gravitational pressure on his head weighing several dozen tons. If he let even one soul attack through, Jake would take control of his body with his telekinesis and crush his heart with a snap of his fingers.